Call to order the Board of County Commissioners Land Use and Public Hearing for Tuesday, November 10th, 2020. Would you all please stand and join us in the pledge? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, everyone. All three commissioners are in attendance, so we do have a quorum. Commissioner Thomas and myself are present in the room. Commissioner Layden is online, so he is virtual. Good afternoon, Commissioner Layden.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Pratt, do we have certification of our agenda?
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Chris Pratt with the County Attorney's Office. 3 items on your agenda this afternoon. The Sterling Ranch Filing 2 First Amendment Project File XT 2020-008. No specialized notice was required for this item. The Plum Creek Plan Development First Amendment Project File ZR 2020-012. This item had published notice and mailed notice accomplished October 15th, 2020, and signed posted notice accomplished October 19th, 2020. And finally, the Sterling Ranch Plan Development Amendment to Water Appeal, Project File MI 2020-010, had signed posted notice accomplished October 1st, 2020, and published notice the same day. All of these items have been properly noticed, and you have jurisdiction to hear them today.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. And do any commissioners have a disclosure for any item on your agenda today?
I have none, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
And I have none, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
And I have none. Thank you. Our next item is land use meeting, and this is 2A. This is Sterling Ranch Filing 2, First Amendment. It's Project File XT 2020-008. Presenting for staff, Chief Planner Brett Thomas.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Brett Thomas representing Planning Services. Project before you is XT 2020-008. A request for a plat recordation extension for Sterling Ranch Filing 2, First Amendment. The owner is DFC Sterling Ranch, LLC. The request is for an extension of the recordation period for the Sterling Ranch Filing 2, First Amendment plat until May 19th, 2021. The applicant's written request indicates the applicant is in the process of obtaining signatures from the owner, as well as revising specific provisions associated with the formation of the homeowners association. Property is 3.76 acres in size and is located immediately south of the intersection of Slate River Street and Horsebrush Lane within Sterling Ranch. An approved minor development final plat is valid for 60 days from the date of approval by the Board of County Commissioners unless extended by the Director or Board. The Director may grant a time extension for plat recordation of up to 1 year from the date of Board approval upon a written request by the applicant or staff for good cause being shown. Further extensions may be granted by the Board at a public meeting upon written request by the applicant or staff. Based on the standards for extensions of plat recordation extension to May 19th, 2021, subject to the 7 original conditions of approval, may be approved by the Board. This concludes staff's presentation.
Thank you, Brett. Questions for staff?
I have none. Thank you.
And I have none, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
And I have none. Thank you, Brett. And Ms. Dunning, the representative for Sterling Ranch is Mark Kiefer. Is Mr. Kiefer on the line?
I do not see him on the line, Commissioner.
Okay, I know we do have representatives from Sterling Ranch in the audience. Would anyone from Sterling Ranch like to address the board? I have a question for you, actually, so maybe you can use either one if you, I have to turn that one on there. And Brock, I know you know the routine of your name and spelling address.
My name, can everyone hear me?
I don't think it's working. She's working on that, Brock. One second. Maybe tap it and see if it's working. There you go.
All right, Brock Smethels on behalf of the applicant, BROCKSMETHILLS, My address is 8155 Piney River Avenue, Suite 200, Littleton, CO 80125.
Okay. Anything to offer to the board, Mr. Smethles?
I know as staff alluded to, we're in the process of getting ready to record this plat and just are asking for the extension to make sure we can get all the necessary documents in order, including a formation of a homeowners association to maintain the townhome parcels that will be within this subdivision.
Thank you. And I will ask if there's any questions for the applicant.
I have none, thank you.
And I have none, Mr. Chair. Thanks.
Very good. No, necessarily have any questions regarding the application, except that, and Brett, did I see 7 conditions of approval from the original extension, from the original approval?
Yes, that's correct.
And Mr. Smethles, are you still in agreement with the 7 conditions of approval?
Yes, we are.
Very good. Thank you. This time, I'll open it up for anyone in the audience who'd like to address the board regarding this application. Ms. Dunning, anyone online?
I see no hands raised. Thank you.
And no one in the room coming forward, so this time we'll close public comment, and we'll bring it back to the board for any other further questions, discussions, and/or motion.
Mr. Chair, you ready for a motion?
Yes.
Commissioner Layden, would you like to make a motion, or would you like me to?
Please go ahead.
I have a motion to approve the request to extend the recordation period for the Sterling Ranch filings to First Amendment replat until May 19th, 2021, project file XT 2020-008.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. No further discussion. All in favor, state aye.
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 And the motion passes. Congratulations. Thank you. Our next item on the agenda under our public hearing is 3A, Plum Creek Plan Development, First Amendment, Project File ZR 2020-012. Presenting for staff, Principal Planner Eric Pavlinek. Might take him a few minutes to get the application pulled up.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Eric Pavlinek, representing Planning Services. The request is a major amendment to the Plum Creek Plan Development. The project number is ZR 2020-012. Shay Holmes is the applicant, and Ann Johnson, Robinson, Neff, and Raganetti is the applicant representative. The request is for a major amendment to the Plum Creek PD. The applicant wants to amend the PD to establish a sign development guide for the property and transfer one dwelling unit from Planning Area B to Planning Area A. The intent of the major PD amendment process is to encourage innovative and creative design and to facilitate a mix of use and development of a balanced community, including residential, business, commercial, recreational, open space, and other selected secondary uses in accordance with Section 24-67-101 of the Colorado Revised Statutes. The major PD amendment process begins with a submittal of an application, following a review period by referral agencies and the public. Notice is given for public hearings before the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners. One adjacent property owner provided correspondence on the application and wanted clarification on the request. Staff provided an email response to the neighbor's public comment dated July 31st, 2020. This correspondence was included within the staff report packet. The Planning Commission heard the proposal at a public hearing on November 2nd, 2020, and recommended approval by a vote of 8-0. The Planning Commission asked about the reason for the increase in sign height, and the applicant responded with it was done for the proportionality of the sign elements. The proposed amendment is applicable to the entire PD, which is outlined in blue on this zoning map. The site is located approximately 1 mile north of the intersection of Roxville Park Road and West Titan Road, just south of the Chatfield State Park. As shown on the aerial, the PD is bounded by the Chatfield State Park to the west, north, and east. The Highland Canal, which is owned and maintained by Denver Water Board, bisects the western side of the property. In total, 879 single-family residential lots, 41 tracts and associated public roads have been platted within the development. The site was rezoned from Agricultural 1 to PD in October of 2016. The preliminary plan was reviewed and approved by the board in December of 2017. Solstice Filing 1 was approved by the board in October of 2018. Solstice Filings 2, 3, and 4 were approved by the board in 2020. And Solstice Filing 5 has been submitted and is currently in review. The application proposes additional freestanding sign standards for the property different from Section 29 of the Douglas County Zoning Resolution as noted on this slide. Generally, in the Douglas County Zoning Resolution, freestanding signs in residential districts are restricted to a maximum height of 15 feet and a maximum sign area of 50 square feet. The application also proposes to transfer one dwelling unit from planning area B to planning area A. This clip from the PD shows the two planning areas, A and B. Planning area B is generally located east and south of the Highline Canal, and planning area A is located west of the Highline Canal and south and west of the Chatfield State Park. The total number of dwelling units in the PD will remain at 1,100. The approval standards for a major PD amendment request are set forth in Section 15 and are listed on this slide. Staff's assessment of the approval standards is discussed in detail within the staff report. Section 1522-.08 sets forth the parameters for the Board of County Commissioners' determination of a major PD amendment request. Staff has evaluated the major PD amendment request in accordance with Sections 1519 through 1523 of the zoning resolution. Should the board find that the approval standards are for the major PD amendment are met, the following conditions should be considered for inclusion in today's motion. Condition number 1, prior to recordation, all minor technical corrections will be made to the PD document to the satisfaction of Douglas County. And condition number 2, all commitments and promises made by the applicant or the applicant's representative during the public hearing and or agreed to in writing and included in the public record have been relied upon by the Board of County Commissioners in approving the application. Therefore, such approval is conditioned upon the applicant's full satisfaction of all such commitments and promises. This concludes my presentation. I'm available to take any questions at this time. Otherwise, Marcus Pochner with the Pochner Company is here representing the applicant and has a presentation.
Thank you, Eric. Any questions for staff at this time?
I have none, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'll reserve my questions following Mr. Pochner's presentation.
Very well, and I have none. Thank you. Mr. Pochner?
Terrific. Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you very much for having us here today. On behalf of Shea Homes, my name is Marcus Pochner. I'm a land use consultant for Shea. My address is 130 Rampart Way, Denver, Colorado, and Pochner is spelled Pachner. I will be very brief, kind of going through about 12 slides here. I do want to give you an overall update, perhaps a snapshot on this emerging community just south of Chatfield. As Eric shared, we are 383 acres. We are 1,100 homes. We can say now we have 6 lots or 6 model homes open. I know, Eric, I'm filling time, by the way, while he gets the presentation. So we have 6 model homes that are open, 4 that are being constructed now. And we are so glad for our neighbors around us that Chatfield Lake Road, the eastern connection road that goes into the park, is now fully open. You can go to the next slide, Eric. Thank you. And we have also realigned Roxborough Road. That is open as well. So all transportation systems are coming through. We really have been focused on the primary infrastructure. You see filing 1 in the middle of the map. All of the infrastructure in filing 1 will be completed by the end of the year, and significant infrastructure in filing 4 will be completed as well. As you know, on the the west side of the High Line, that becomes a ranch home community, and so we've ventured across the Highline Canal now for that construction for the ranch homes. Next slide shows, as Eric indicated, these are the 4 filings that have come before you. The first was in 2018, and then we had 3 approved in this calendar year. In total, 879 of the 1,100 homes have been platted at this point. Next slide, please. Perhaps the finest jewel or best part of this community is really the trail connections, the remarkable 71-mile Highline Canal that kind of has a ribbon of amenities through this site, and the Chatfield State Park. We are working very significantly on those trail corridors and those connections and really blending that into the existing community to the south of us as well. We are here today to briefly or respectfully request 2 amendments to our PD. This PD was originally before some of you in 2016. In October, we got our first approval, October of 2016. The next slide actually details these 2 amendments. The first is moving 1 dwelling unit from B to A, and then to create a side guideline plan to go along with this community. Next slide, please. Here's that first one. We can go to the next slide. As Eric detailed, the left to right of planning area A is on your left, the western side of this site. We originally had 422 homes there. The eastern and southern or eastern side of the site, kind of enveloped by the Highline Canal, had 678 homes. We are asking, as you see on the next slide, to transfer one of those homes from planning area B to planning area A. You can see kind of, it's hard to read at the bottom of that screen. Frankly, the transfer of that unit in planning area B just to the west of Roxborough Road was because there is a 5-acre parcel, a double lot just to the south of us, and it actually made much more sense not to be so close to them in a buffer. Mr. Lariat, I believe, is here in the audience. We actually looked at putting that closer to his house and determined that was not a very good idea. So we've moved and kind of perfected our geometry and put it on the far west part of the site to really just balance the site out. As you see here, this is not an increase in the total number of dwelling units. It stays at 1,100. Our second amendment request on the next slide is to create the sign guidelines. If you go to the next slide, you all are very familiar with Douglas County Zoning Resolution 29. That is the default measures for the sign code on this site. We did not have specific sign guidance in our original PD only because it hadn't been developed yet. So simply what we are doing today is putting in place a signage development guide for the rest of the site and the development of this site. This next slide, please, it shows kind of the areas that we're dealing with and how we approach this site. As you see in 290202, it says that you follow the underlying code except when a separate development guide has been adopted, and that's what we're presenting here today. Next slide. This shows our amendments to the PD. This is 5B, and it talks about the 3 different types of signs primarily that we're focused on. This is the entry monument you see in the larger box that is pulled out. This is a maximum of 210 square feet, a maximum height of 18 feet. We have only one of those that is on the new, if you go to the next map, please, the next slide. It's on the lower right-hand side, the southeast entrance there along Chatfield Lake Road. That is really the entry monumentation. We have provided a depiction of the sign. This was the next one. is actually our earliest rendering. There's more topography perhaps in that earlier rendering than there is on the site. The next sign actually shows it now in purpose or in place, and this shows our final design. I will point out, because it was mentioned earlier, our 18 feet, that is frankly a reflection of siting it on site. The community is named Solstice, and really that 3 foot where the sun is there was really appropriate when we sited it on site, that would be an 18-foot height request, and that's why that is consistent throughout our package. Next slide, please. This then talks about the amenity monuments, the monuments for our amenities throughout the site, the parks and the community amenities. This shows that we are asking for a maximum of 50 square feet and a maximum height of 18 square feet, or 18 feet, excuse me. This next slide actually shows a depiction of that. This again indicates right there at the Highline House where you see the star, that's the main community gathering place. And the next slide actually shows a rendering. As you can see, we certainly will not approach anything like 18 feet on this, but it's consistency of the sign plan. This shows, again, the Highline House signage that will be provided at our amenity. Next slide, please. Our final portion of this that really focuses on the temporary wayfinding and marketing signs that are in place. This is very consistent with development across the area. In Douglas County, we actually described 3 different types, the small, medium, and large, and have all the provisions that go along with those. The next 2 slides actually show renderings of signs, the ladder sign on your left that are more directional throughout the site that are up now, and then ones that really show depictions of and renderings of the amenities that will be built. So these are temporary signs, as I said. They will be down 90 days after the final CO has been granted for the site. So this is just a way of moving people around the site and working through it at this time. Next slide. I think this really does bring us to kind of our final conclusion. I think we have been so incredibly grateful for your continued leadership and working with staff on this. We spent a great deal of time making sure that the signage package reflected kind of the underlying values, the approval criteria, and our underlying PD. So I will say, Mr. Chair, we certainly do accept the 2 conditions that were proffered by staff, and we would respectfully request your support for these amendments. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bachner.
You bet.
Questions for the applicant?
I do have some, Mr. Chair. Mr. Bachner, so if I understand this, our height right now for signs is 15 feet, but you're asking for 18. But you showed a picture of one that said Highline House. That won't be 18 feet tall. How tall do you think that one will be?
That's correct, Commissioner Thomas. Thank you very much. I think that I'm going to give you a guess on that. I know that I saw in the initial package. You can go up, maybe down 2 or 3 slides, please, Eric. Keep going. I think it goes. Oh, sorry, we're going the wrong way. I apologize. There you go. Any of those signs, I think you're seeing that on site. Those are about 10 to 12 feet on that. So, Commissioner, you are correct. The reason we had that initial 18 feet and we kept it consistent throughout is really that marker of the solstice on the entry monument.
Okay, I don't have any other questions right now. Thank you.
Mr. Bachner, thank you for the presentation, and it's always a pleasure when you come before us because you're always so prepared and have all the information at your fingertips, and that's always really helpful for us. You know, in the packet, engineering just had an issue with regard to signage not being in the public right-of-way. I just wanted to clarify for the record, and perhaps you can provide us and fill in the gaps there, that these signs are not in the public right-of-way.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Layden. Thank you, Commissioner Layden. Yeah, I should have made that clear. And actually, in our boxes that popped up, we did say they cannot be in the right-of-way. So, Commissioner, it's actually 2 things. They cannot be in the right-of-way. They will not be in the right-of-way. And also, as importantly, we have to respect all sight lines. So we work with engineering on all the appropriate sight lines outside of the right-of-way where those will be placed. And I will say, I will say the respect of the contour of the land and a lot of where our berming has occurred. You all have studied a lot of our transitions and buffering from the existing community to the south. We were very mindful of that where we placed, particularly our entry monumentation, is really behind a lot of that buffering that we've created so that there is not view of these signs anywhere to the existing communities.
That answers my question, Mr. Pochner, and thank you for clarifying that for the
Sure,
public.
thank you.
And Mr. Buckner, you're always succinct, and again, I agree, well prepared. I don't have any questions, so I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. This time, we'll open up for anyone in the audience like to address the board. And we have somebody in the room, so Ms. Dunning, I'll ask you here in a moment.
You ready?
Yes.
Okay. Dennis Larratt, Larratt, 10990 North Sunshine Drive, 80125, representing the Chatfield Community Association. We have three minor questions on the signage, none relative to the transfer. The transfer's rather minor. If you think about the height of this room, this is about 18 feet. Roughly, I don't know the exact height, but not far off of that. That seems inappropriate for the trail signage throughout the development. I think it was done as an expedient in putting the maximum heights in all locations, but that wouldn't be practical either for the users or for the relatively rural area that these are located in. We also think that the 1 square foot size for the recreational trail signs is unreasonably small. If you're trying to have a two-directional sign, having 1 square foot is pretty small. So that's, I mean, smaller is probably better from our perspective, but that seems almost impractical. And then finally, we would ask that none of the community marketing signage points directly at the rural residential lots that are adjacent to the development. I spoke with Mr. Pochner earlier in the hallway, and I believe that from what he showed me, none of them would be as planned. So those were our three questions.
Thank you, Mr. Larratt. Ms. Dunning, anyone online?
Thank you, Commissioner. I have no hands raised.
And I see no one else in the room coming forward. So at this time, we'll close public comment. And I'll ask Mr. Pochner to address a couple of the questions that were raised.
Yes, Commissioner, and thank you, Mr. Larratt, for those comments. I would say, and I'm going to defer on the wildlife sign or the trail signs. As you all know, we have worked so closely with the Highline Canal Conservancy and Douglas County on that trail connection. So I frankly will say I was a little surprised at that signage as well, but I know that is something that they have developed uniformly along the whole 71 miles. So I know we are being consistent with that. I certainly will go back and talk about that, but I know that really reflects those underlying values. We're actually putting signs up for them. I think we're at mile 6, and that will be along the entire Highline. So I think we're being consistent with that. We concur wholeheartedly. There will be no marketing signs that address the existing community. I should say there is certainly an entry sign as you're on Roxborough Road, right? We understand that that's more of a, we call it a ladder sign, kind of a moving people through the site so they know where they're going. But our marketing signs and those things will not be touching or looking at or addressing the community to the south of us. So we'll do that. I think the last one, and I'll just say, maybe Mr. Larratt's first point was about the 18 feet. I understand the point. Again, we did go on site to really cite that. That sign is 3.6 feet wide. I think it's 3.6 to 4 feet wide where the sun is on that. We think that's a very minor kind of width of sign. It also, we think it's appropriate. I will say the reason we have 18 on the other parts is frankly for ease of administration. There is no way that the rest of our marketing signs, directional signs, and those things are going to be at 18 feet. We do that simply really to work with the county so they don't have 5 different standards of every sign that come through. So we agree, I think, on all the points with Mr. Larratt, with the exception of we believe 18 feet is appropriate for that entry monumentation that comes in.
Very well. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. All right, I'll ask if there's any further questions for the board.
I don't have any other questions.
And I have no further questions, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
And I don't either. I'll just have a comment. I know it's not unusual when there's a PD, I think as explained, that when the PD was created, there was not the sign design element involved. And for this to be brought to us at a later date is very sensible.
And I agree with that, that as the development is being built, you need to make sure that the customers or potential customers know how to go and where they're going. And so I think that these are done tastefully, and I understand the request, and I am in support of this.
And I would just echo that. I think Mr. Pochner has done a good job, as always, with sharing with the public the issues that came up during both the Planning Commission hearing and here. And, based on the 1520.01 et sequitur approval standards, it appears that all of the approval standards have been met.
With no further questions or discussion, I'll entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion to approve the First Amendment to the Plum Creek Plan Development with the two conditions as presented. Project file ZR 2020-012.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. No further discussion. All in favor, state aye.
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 Aye. The motion passes. Congratulations. Thank you. Brings us to our next item on the agenda, 3B. This is Sterling Ranch Plan Development, Amendment to the Water Appeal. Project file MI 2020-010. Presenting for staff, Chief Planner Brett Thomas.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Brett Thomas representing Plan Services. The request is for approval of an amendment to Sterling Ranch Water Supply Standards Appeal. Project number is MI 2020-010. The applicants are Sterling Ranch LLC, the Sterling Ranch Community Authority Board, and Dominion Water and Sanitation District. Before I proceed, I would like to mention that comments were submitted today by the Chatfield Community Association, and those comments have been provided to the board in the packet of materials to be reviewed prior to the meeting. The applicants request approval of an amended and restated appeal. The current request is intended to streamline and clarify multiple provisions of the appeal. One significant change is to allow the Sterling Ranch Community Authority Board to establish its own water demand standards for Sterling Ranch, similar to existing districts as defined in Section 18A. An appeal to the standards of Section 18A begins with submittal of an application. Following a review period by referral agencies and the public, notice is given for public hearings before the Planning Commission and Board of County Commissioners. Comments received through the referral and the Planning Commission process are attached to the staff report. Most comments from surrounding HOAs and districts centered on the proposed water demand standard as discussed in supplemental information provided with the request, indicating that it's premature to establish a lower demand standard. Staff and the applicant have clarified that this request does not establish any demand standard. Rather, it allows for the CAB to establish a demand standard to be reviewed by the county as part of subsequent development applications. The Planning Commission considered the applicant's request for approval at a public hearing on October 19th. Public testimony was provided from a representative of the Chatfield Community Association in opposition to the project. Concerns focused primarily on the inconsistency with the original appeals commitment to modify demand standards only after a 5-year period of time. Commissioners asked several questions to better understand how the water demand standard would actually be established, reviewed, and approved. Staff and the applicant clarified that water demand standards would be evaluated by the county as part of the proposed water supply submitted for individual land use applications. Staff noted that the applicant has submitted a water supply using the recently adopted CAB demand standards as part of the Sterling Ranch Preliminary Plan 6 land use application. The preliminary plan is in process and will be considered at public hearings before the Planning Commission and Board in December of this year. The Planning Commission recommended approval of the appeal, subject to one condition proposed by staff. by a vote of 4-3. Those recommending denial expressed concerns that not all the water consultant's changes had been made and that it appeared premature to allow the CAB to establish an alternative demand standard. These commissioners cited that approval standards 071 and 072 were not met. Those recommending approval felt that all the approval standards had been met and that it was appropriate to allow an opportunity for consideration of lesser standards as part of future land use applications. The proposed appeal is applicable to the entire Sterling Ranch PD, which is outlined in red on this zoning map. The site is located generally west of the intersection of US Highway 85 and Titan Parkway in the Chatfield Valley. The Sterling Ranch PD extends north and south of Titan Road, between Moore Road and Rampart Range Road. As shown on the aerial, the Sterling Ranch PD is west of Moore Road, south of Chatfield State Park, east of Rampart Range Road, and north of agriculturally zoned land. The property was rezoned from Agricultural 1, Rural Residential, and General Industrial to planned development with approval of the Sterling Ranch PD by the board in July of 2013. Associated with the approval of Sterling Ranch PD, the board also approved the Sterling Ranch Water Supply Standards Appeal for certain provisions to Section 18A of the zoning resolution. The applicants are proposing to make changes to the appeal document as described within pages 2 and 3 of the staff report and as summarized here. Update the definition section, restate and clarify the water documentation submittal requirements for a development application, remove sections related to scope of appeal, water conservation covenants, conditions of development approvals, water demand standards, service plans for retail water districts, timeline, Chatfield Valley Water Supply Framework, advisory panel, Dominion Board, and annual water information. Include separate sections to include approval standards and water demand standards, including the ability for the CAB to establish its own water demand standards. Include a section granting greater authority to Dominion and CAB in decisions related to water infrastructure development. Commit that the ratio of renewable to non-renewable water supplies will be 70-30 at build-out. Establish that applications for major amendments to the PD are required to include water documentation. Continues to allow for the use of rainwater where permitted by state. Continues the commitment for the CAB to request that the Colorado Conservation Board review its water conservation plan. Include a new wholesale water and wastewater cumulative service commitment template letter from Dominion, and include a new water and sanitary sewer service template letter from the CAB. The approval standards for an appeal are set forth in section 1808A.07 and listed on the slide. Staff's assessment of the approval standards is discussed in detail within pages 6 and 7 of the staff report. Section 1808A.07 of the zoning resolution sets forth the parameters for the board's determination on the appeal request as noted on this slide. Staff has evaluated the appeal request in accordance with sections 1808A and 1809A of the zoning resolution. Should the board find that the approval standards for the appeal are met, the following proposed conditions should be considered for inclusion in the motion. Condition number 1, prior to recordation, all minor technical corrections will be made to the amended and restated Sterling Ranch Water Appeal document to the satisfaction of Douglas County. And condition number 2, all commitments and promises made by the applicant or the applicant's representative during the public hearing and/or agreed to in writing and included in the public record have been relied upon by the Board of County Commissioners in approving the application. Therefore, such approval is conditioned upon the applicant's full satisfaction of all such commitments and promises. This concludes staff's presentation. I'm available to take questions on the staff report at this time if the board wishes. I would also like to note that the county's water consultant, Bruce Lytle, is in attendance. Otherwise, Brock Smethels and Brian Connolly are prepared to present on behalf of the applicants.
Thank you, Brett. Questions for staff at this time?
Not now, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I'll reserve my questions following the presentation from the applicant.
And I do. Thank you, Brett. I have no further questions. This time, would the applicant representatives like to address the board?
That's my presentation on the.
Apologize for the technical difficulty. I'll give you my name and address while we're waiting. Roxmethils, Smethills, address 8155 Piney River Avenue, Middleton, Colorado, 80125. Let's see if this works. Well, I'm here today to present the Sterling Ranch Water Appeal 2020 revisions to the 2013 Water Appeal. The main purpose for this is Sterling Ranch, obviously, is depicted in this picture, is grown materially, and the 2013 appeal was approved prior to even any homeowners occupying the property. I wanted to include several photos of the property just to give the board a background of the development and the status of the development. This is just the first filing looking from the east to west over the houses that have been constructed. This is the Overlook Clubhouse. It's the Cabs Recreational Center that just opened roughly about a month ago in filing 1. The same clubhouse looking from the pool at the facility. This is the Sterling Center coming in looking to the northwest off of Titan Road. It's 30,000 square feet, mixed-use building that includes the cab. And then this is the continued development of Sterling Ranch Filing 1, which is nearing its completion. So of the 794 homes that were in Filing 1, approximately 730 are currently occupied. And then before I kind of transition into the meat of our presentation, you'll notice that we incorporated a new marketing line, which is Sterling Ranch. Joy resides here, and that means more than just a tagline. The previous landowner to Sterling Ranch prior to Sterling Ranch LLC was Joy Burns, and she unfortunately passed away in the past several months, and we continue to honor her legacy on the project. So the agenda for today, I will be speaking about the introduction to Sterling Ranch, which I've already done, the 2020 Water Appeal Purpose, why are we here, the 2013 Appeal History and Challenges, 2020 Water Appeal Amendment Overview, and then the water demand data, at which point I will turn it over to Mary Kay Probosnik, the General Manager of Dominion, to go over Dominion's regional water supply system, as well as Denise Hoganis, who is the General Manager of the Sterling Ranch Community Authority Board, to discuss water demand management initiatives. And then finally, Brian Connolly will summarize the application as it stands. So I am Brock Smethills, President of Sterling Ranch Development Company. I'm here representing the applicant with this application. I oversee most of the development, particularly land entitlement, commercial property negotiations, and technology pertaining specifically to water. So as of this year, Sterling Ranch is the #1 selling master plan community in Colorado, with roughly 311 homes sold as of October 25th. That equates to roughly 871 new Douglas County residents moving into Sterling Ranch this year alone. So just a brief background on Sterling Ranch. The entire PD is roughly 3,400 acres, approximately 1,300 acres of which is designed to be open space and parks. It's zoned for a maximum density of 12,050 units. There are 730 homes occupied, as I previously mentioned. We have approximately 2,100 lots under development in 3 villages, which is Filing 1, or Providence Village, which is on the northeast corner, Ascent Village, which is due south, and then Prospect Village, which is adjacent to Roxborough Village. Sterling Ranch comprises of multiple housing types, and it is a mixed-use community, including multifamily townhomes and single-family development. We are an outstanding green community and have been recognized nationally for conscious land planning and water, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. We have a leading smart home technology system that was developed with Siemens Building Solutions, along with a proprietary fiber system that delivers symmetrical gig internet to the residents in Sterling Ranch. As I mentioned earlier, we have a partnership with Siemens that helped develop a lot of the underlying technology that allows us to be able to bring the data that warrants changing the water demands. And then finally, full build out of the entire Sterling Ranch plan development is estimated to take about 20 years.
The entities that are involved in this application, Sterling Ranch LLC is the applicant, which was the applicant in the original PD. I am representing Sterling Ranch Development Company and have been asked to present on behalf of the applicant. Dominion Water and Sanitation District and Sterling Ranch Community Authority Board participated in the application, but more in a support role as the original PD was submitted by Sterling Ranch LLC. The fresh water is most likely one of the most important issues facing mankind in the coming millennium. At the birth of Sterling Ranch, 18A required roughly 0.75 acre feet per home per year, which equates to around 245,000 gallons per year. The original 2013 appeal lowered that to 130,000 gallons, or roughly 0.4 acre feet. Today, after data from a 2-year study of the CAB's own homeowners and their usage, suggests that usage is actually closer to 35,000 or 36,000 gallons to 74,000 gallons, or between 0.112 acre feet and 0.226 acre feet. The CAB will be adopting water demand standards that are roughly between 0.14 and 0.25 acre feet, or roughly 46,000 gallons or 42,000 gallons. The CAB has implemented several water demand management initiatives here on the right that Denise will be discussing further in the presentation. The 2020 water appeal purpose. This request simply states that the CAB can propose and the board can consider demand standards in the future. This particular appeal does not adopt a new demand standard today. The BOCC maintains final approval over future land use applications that modify the water demand standard. Sterling Ranch has reached a level of maturity that necessitates change. Approximately 45% of the build-out water delivery system is complete or under construction today. Water demand management works, as Denise will discuss, and we need to create a new and necessary process to reward the CAB ratepayers for their efficient use of water. And that is in compliance with the water section of the 2040 Comprehensive Master Plan, Section 7. And then finally, as Brett alluded to, a lot of the changes to this appeal were discussed in depth with staff to try and make the process easier for both the applicant and staff to review these applications as they come forward in the future. So Douglas County and Sterling Ranch LLC have aligned goals. The Douglas County 2040 Comprehensive Master Plan Water Supply Goals stipulates in Goal 7-1 to prolong the life of water resources, namely Objective 7-1A, minimize water consumption, Objective 7-1B, maximize the efficient use of water, Objective 7-1C, support long-term water supply planning, and Objective 7-1D, promote public education and awareness about water. This appeal, we feel, addresses each of these objectives in Goal 7-1. The history of the 2013 appeal. The 2013 appeal reduced the demand standard from 0.75 acre feet per home to 0.4. It created a program called the Chatfield Valley Framework to make available approximately 124 acre feet of water for nearby communities. It established 2 different ways in which water for a development application could be provided. Section 4.1 was directly from Dominion or another special district. Section 4.2 was directly from an incorporated town or city. Created approval criteria for the development applications and whether the water came from Section 4.1 or 4.2. And then it required that in order to update the water demands, that 100 homes would be monitored over 5 years. The updated water demands out of this calculation would then have to satisfy the 98th percentile of high water users. This would result in the average ratepayer subsidizing the highest water rate, or the highest water users across the entire community. Challenges associated with the original appeal. The approval criteria in sections 4.2 and 4.3 were inconsistent, and the documentation for each section was different. The appendices were outdated and were no longer accurate. The commitments around renewable versus non-tributary groundwater were vague and have been clarified in this new appeal. The stagnant water demands in the formulas to calculate them were not flexible enough to reflect the actual usage and consumption in Sterling Ranch. The 2020 water appeal simplifies the documentation required by Douglas County and reduces staff's and the applicant's time to compile such information. The appendices have been removed and updated. We create a clear commitment around the ratio of renewable versus non-tributary groundwater, and it creates a process by which retail water providers can submit alternative water demands subject to review and approval by the board, and Dominion can grow into infrastructure at such a time as necessary based on actual demand. And then these charts here, I thought were just illustrative of what's been going on in the water community in Douglas County. These demand standards are provided to the board for reference, but are not technically a part of this application, as the demand standards will be reviewed at a subsequent land use approval hearing. So the interesting piece, this data comes from a study that was funded by the South Metro Water Supply Authority and Douglas County in 2016. And I've highlighted selectively 3 water providers. You'll notice that Castle Rock, the reported residential water use from 2010 to 2014 was 0.251 acre feet. And from 2013 was 0.247 acre feet. Centennial, 2013 to 2016 was 0.256 acre feet. And Parker was 0.272 acre feet. The numbers on the right are those reported residential consumption numbers, adding in system loss from the point of water treatment or water delivery to the home. The next slide represents what is estimated to be the CAB's water demand standards based on a new resolution that the CAB will be approving will be voting on this week. Indoor only and multifamily will ultimately be 0.14 acre feet, and single family detached large will be 0.252 acre feet, or roughly in line within 20% of Castle Rock's current water usage. And again, where this information was generated, it was generated by a study that was funded by the South Metro Water Supply Authority in Douglas County. The water efficiency master plan that the town of Castle Rock prepared, and then as well as selected portions of the state water plan. So ultimately, promises made, promises kept. Sterling Ranch LLC, Sterling Ranch Development Company, Dominion, and CAB made the promise that Dominion would build a predominantly renewable system, and it has. And Sterling Ranch CAB has enforced water demand management as originally envisioned. And with that, I will be turning over the presentation to Mary Kay Provoznik, who's the General Manager of Dominion Water and Sanitation District. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smethels.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Mary Kay Provoznik. I'm the General Manager of Dominion Water and Sanitation District. Our address is 9250 East Castilla Avenue, Suite 210, Greenwood Village, Colorado 80112. I'm excited to present today. I've been in front of you guys over the years presenting a water supply vision and a demand management approach that has not only incorporated predominantly renewable water, that has in a region that has historically been on groundwater, but also has the flexibility to scale to the actual needs of the customers. Dominion was formed as part of the county's vision to bring renewable water and access to more centralized water and wastewater services to Northwest Douglas County. As a wholesale water and wastewater provider of 33,000 acres, Dominion has been planning for the communities in the area, including the full build-out of Sterling Ranch. While those within our service area are not required to receive service from Dominion, we are open to serve retail districts, including Sterling Ranch, which is the 3,400-acre area depicted to the north of this map in the pink, and entities that qualify under the Chatfield Valley framework, of which Thunderbird is currently a qualified water provider for future potential service. We are also available to serve existing and future retail water, wastewater, and stormwater districts that serve residents and businesses in their service area. Since our inception in 2004, we have been strategic and innovative in our approach to provide reliable water and wastewater services. Our water supply is a conjunctive water supply, meaning it is made up primarily of renewable water. In fact, our water supply started, as you know, at 100% renewable. Renewable supplies are often seasonally variable and thus may be affected by dry years. Most of Dominion's renewable supplies, however, are contractual obligations with Denver Water and Aurora, meaning that their deliveries, while variable, are predictably reliable when used in conjunction with storage and groundwater. Groundwater, while not renewable, is a valuable resource to the communities of Douglas County and is applied in the Dominion water supply as a secondary backup water supply for dry years. By having an integrated system, Dominion fully and efficiently utilizes its resources and therefore provides a reliable and cost-effective service. As regional cooperation continues to integrate and mature, Dominion adds components to its delivery system, and there will be more opportunities to best use its renewable supply. This graphic illustrates a few things about Dominion's water supply to date. The first of which is that we have 6,800 acre feet that is either owned or under our control. Using the 2020 demand standard, Sterling Ranch is projecting a need for 2,600 acre feet. Is this okay? So the dashed line on the graphic illustrates Sterling Ranch's full build-out demand. The dark blue dashed line here shows the projection of the actual use of demand. It's 1,140, oh, I'm sorry, let me show. This is the 1,145 acre feet that has been considered and approved by Douglas County. The dashed line below it is where we've actually used water and where we project it for the approved plans and plats. What that shows is that we started at 115 acre feet of use in 2019. We're projecting 200 acre feet in 2020, and it stays well below the considered and approved water supply, let alone our portfolio, for many, many years. In short, we have adequate water supply to serve Sterling Ranch. We support their efforts to incentivize their community to be water efficient, and we are flexible for the actual needs of the community. We have developed and are continuing to develop infrastructure and other water supplies that add additional reliability, flexibility, and increased efficiencies to the system as our services grow. On this map, just a reminder, on the east, this is the infrastructure for WISE. This is the infrastructure with our partners to bring that WISE water down to and through Castle Rock. And then this is the pipeline that we have referred to as the Eastern Regional Project. This year, we have also closed on 500 acre feet of storage in Chatfield. Through our regional partnerships and relationships, Dominion is practicing what many leading water organizations have identified as the key strategy for future water in Colorado. By the nature of being tied to several independent water supplies, partnering water providers, regional infrastructure, and our own robust local system, we have and are continuing to build into the ability to fully use and reuse our supplies to be resilient under different hydrologic and supply conditions. As Brock presented, we have done what we said we would do. Systems like this require strategic timing and significant investment. As you can see on this table, we have invested millions of dollars in supply opportunities and infrastructure for our current service commitments and beyond, to the benefit of our current and future customers. And we are committed to developing in ways that keep our costs competitive into the future. We are responsibly managing our assets and are helping our customers to do the same. This includes integrating water budgets into our planning with our customer retail districts in a way that helps manage demand, provides financial stability, and provides flexibility. On center stage for us this year was the Eastern Regional Pipeline that runs between Castle Rock and Sterling Ranch. This pipeline ties Dominion to all of its eastern supplies and creates an immediate 2,000 acre feet of accessible supplies upon its completion. As of today, the pipeline contract is complete. Currently, Dominion is working on the tank piece of the system and the connections to both at the ends of the pipe to Castle Rock and Sterling Ranch. As shown here, this is a sizable project that brings significant asset to Northwest Douglas County. Today, we have all of the water supply and much of the treatment and storage infrastructure in place to serve Sterling Ranch's full build-out. We continue to use our experience in leading industry expertise to develop and evolve our services to provide sustainable, reliable, and economical services to our customers. This includes evaluating and implementing water supplies, timing of infrastructure, water supplies like rainwater harvesting that add valuable water supply, improve efficiency, and provide other potential benefits, including non-point source pollution mitigation. This also includes developing a system that has the flexibility to tie in potential users within our service area as they choose to connect, and to encourage smart use and technological advances. Most importantly, we look to right-size our system and our cost to provide reliable and cost-effective service as we grow. In summary, Dominion has more water than Sterling Ranch community needs. Using real data that Sterling Ranch has collected, the 1145 acre-feet considered and approved by this board, which is a fraction of the 6,800 acre-feet that Dominion owns and has control of, is more than adequate for Sterling Ranch for the next 5 to 7 years, and will be enough to serve all of Sterling Ranch's indoor needs at build-out. As a result, much of Dominion's system, as built, will not need to be operated for several years. The county approved a process for the Sterling Ranch plan development that incentivizes demand management while still assuring adequate supply. The agreement between Dominion and CAB allows for demand management approach that aligns with their water budget goals. The Sterling Ranch Water Appeal empowers Sterling Ranch to use water efficiently. It allows infrastructure investment to be made appropriately, and it moves Douglas County into the leadership role for how water supply and demand should be considered in the future. In conclusion, Dominion supports the Water Appeal Amendment. Thank you for your time. At this time, I would like to introduce Denise Hoganis, the General Manager of Sterling Ranch CAB.
Thank you, Ms. Privosnik.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Thank you for hearing from us today. My name is Denise Hoganis, Hogenes. My address is 9350 Roxborough Park Road, Littleton, Colorado, 80125. As Mary Kay just explained, in 2014, Douglas County Board of Commissioners authorized the CAB to provide water and sewer services to the owners, taxpayers, and residents within Sterling Ranch. CAB is the retail water provider serving commercial and residential ratepayers. CAB is committed to achieving best-in-state water demand management through technology, resident education, and policy enforcement. Our success in Sterling Ranch is Douglas County's success. Tonight, I'd like to start off by explaining the promises made and kept by Sterling Ranch through its water management demand initiatives. These include infrastructure requirements, consumer education, and consumer empowerment. CAB has successfully implemented water demand management initiatives as originally promised, and will take a moment to explain these initiatives in depth. Currently, each home constructed in Sterling Ranch has dual water metering, an indoor meter and an outdoor meter. This is a very unique metering system and allows CAB and its consumers to clearly understand how much water is consumed both inside and outside the home. Dual water metering is unprecedented technology. Sterling Ranch is the only community in Colorado with dual water metering, and having this system allows CAB, as the retail water provider, to set tier water rates that financially incentivizes the user to conserve both indoor and outdoor water. In addition to having dual water meters, all homes in Sterling Ranch are required to install water fixtures and appliances that are WaterSense and Energy Star labeled. This includes things like toilets, faucets, and appliances. The Water Management Demand Initiative also provides for consumer education. The two women that you see on your slide are part of the CAB staff. Sterling Ranch CAB currently has these two full-time staff members dedicated to homeowner and builder education. The primary role of these team members is to assist ratepayers in understanding their water budget and to plan the design of their landscaping to easily thrive within their water budget. Staff also is charged with checking credentials of installing landscapers to ensure that they meet certain minimum requirements and are certified irrigation installers. Attached, you will see water calculation spreadsheets on this side of the screen and sample landscape plans. Staff uses these as education materials and to explain to homeowners their water budget and the implementation aspects of using drought-tolerant plant material. And last but not least, Sterling Ranch consumers are empowered to control their water consumption. This is the demonstration of our Ratio system, which is an irrigation system that is installed in each home, and it gives homeowners real-time consumption data. It includes evapotranspiration sensors, which will shut down irrigation during precipitation events. In addition, the system allows homeowners the ability to remotely turn on and off their system when needed. Here we have the indoor water rates, outdoor water rates, and tiered pricing, but most importantly, we have the water budgets here on the left side. So what happens is homeowners receive a water budget. If they stay within their water budget, they pay at the Tier 1 rate. If they go above, then they go to Tier 2 and Tier 3. In conclusion, CAB ratepayers have been stewards of water and the resource, and they should be rewarded for their efforts. CAB and Dominion have ensured that everyone in Sterling Ranch will have water. We now need to focus on ensuring that the ratepayers don't overpay for that water. Our approach is based upon 2 years of real water use data, and we'll evaluate the data use every 2 years after that. Infrastructure must be built in a time-appropriate manner and not before it's needed. Our proposal will keep water rates competitive, efficient, and aligned with water demand management. Overserving water to Sterling Ranch is not in Douglas County's best interest. Currently, CAB is required to reserve water that could be used for other Douglas County communities. The plan is not efficient use of water as stated in Objective 7-1B of Douglas County's 2040 Comprehensive Master Plan. The CAB is better suited to represent and determine the residents' needs than anyone else. So why does this matter? Currently, CAB is required to reserve more than 40% more water delivery infrastructure than is needed to serve its community. This has created 3 unintended consequences. 1, acquiring water or building water infrastructure that isn't utilized increases the ratepayers' water cost, even though they have proven to be stewards of the resource. Secondarily, oversized systems that are currently required go underutilized and are maintained through a practice called flushing. Flushing is running water through the fire hydrants to remove the excess chloramines that build up. Here is a photo of flushing that just occurred yesterday. This is a wasteful but required practice. And lastly, Sterling Ranch requirement to reserve water that won't be needed deprives other Douglas County citizens from access to that water. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Our final presenter is Brian Connolly. He is an attorney at Otten Johnson.
Thank you, Ms. Hoganis.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Brian Connolly, last name is spelled Connolly. Business address is 950 17th Street, Suite 1600 in Denver. And I'm with the law firm of Otten, Johnson, Robinson, Neff, and Raganetti. So this afternoon, my job is to walk briefly through what the revised water appeal contains, and then also to speak to the approval criteria. So in terms of what the water appeal amendment contains, first and foremost is streamlined submittal requirements. As Brock mentioned, the 2013 water appeal had duplicative and perhaps confusing submittal requirements. So we'll have standardized will serve letters and service commitment letters from Dominion and the CAB as part of this. We'll have a resolution from the CAB that will establish the water demand standard. Again, the water demand standard is something that the board would see with a future development application. That's not something that's being approved today. There'd be an analysis of the sufficiency of the proposed supply, a report on the ratio between tributary and non-tributary water. There's a requirement in the appeal that relates to that ratio. It would contain an analysis of the water distribution system. We provide all information that's made available to the state water engineer, as well as other items that are requested by the county. This would avoid resubmittal of duplicative information. So once this information is submitted one time, then it would remain sort of submitted for future development applications. So it would not require this resubmittal of all this information with each development application. As far as the county's evaluation of development applications, we have the documentation standards in there that the county would review, as well as new approval criteria that would apply to a development application. The approval criteria summed up are that the water supply can be used for the proposed development, the water supply is adequate, and that takes into account hydrologic variation, and the water supply is sufficient to meet the water demand standard that is established by the CAB. The CAB would set the water demand standards that would be subject to providing supporting documentation and evidence that would support that demand standard. And again, you, the board, and the Planning Commission would have the chance to review those demand standards with future development applications. In terms of matching infrastructure with demand, we would submit evidence that demonstrates demonstrates the cost and feasibility of developing the necessary infrastructure to better time the construction of infrastructure with development in Sterling Ranch. With respect to your approval standards, you have 3 approval standards in the zoning resolution pertaining to water appeals. 2 of them apply here. The first is that the request is not detrimental to the health, safety, or welfare of the present or future inhabitants of the county. We believe that the revised water appeal provides a more efficient system for dealing with both setting a water demand standard as well as delivering infrastructure to Sterling Ranch. It will provide ensure that there will be sufficient water provided to the community while reducing cost burdens of the existing water appeal on the community. So we believe it's consistent with the first approval standard. The second approval standard talks about providing sufficient data of alternate water demand criteria so the water supply is sufficient in terms of quantity, quality, and dependability. Again, what this does is sets forth a procedure by which we will provide documentation with future development applications to ensure that the board has the ability to review that the water supply it will be sufficient in terms of quality, quantity, and dependability. And like I say, the third of the approval standards does not apply to this application. Before I wrap up, one thing I want to point out is at the Planning Commission hearing, there was a robust discussion about a referral letter that was provided by Lytle Water Solutions that provided some comments on the last draft of the water appeal that we had before we went to hearings. We incorporated some of those comments into the water appeal, and some of them we didn't incorporate. And so I just want to explain briefly why we chose not to incorporate some of the comments, as I think this will also be a subject of some of the public comment. Certainly, we understand Mr. Lytle. We respect him. We respect his review of the water appeal. One of our goals in this document is to make this a more usable document. The 2013 water appeal is complicated. It's difficult to read. It's difficult to understand, and it's difficult to administer. Excuse me. So one of our goals here was to ensure that from just a language standpoint, this is a streamlined document. And so we provided a response letter to Mr. Lytle's referral letter. That response letter details why we chose not to incorporate some of those concepts, and it was really to ensure that we had a document that was easily understandable, that would 20 years from now, 30 years from now, when we're not around, none of us are around to review it, we all can be confident that somebody's going to be able to pick it up and understand that document. So the reasons that we chose not to incorporate some of those edits were really for sort of pure legal drafting reasons, and Mr. Pratt and I worked together on sort of what we would incorporate and what we wouldn't. And so the reason we didn't incorporate those is not because we're trying to skirt around advice of the county's consultant or anything like that. It's really to ensure that we have a streamlined document that's easy to understand and that can survive sort of the test of time and be administered over the course of time. So with that being said, happy to answer any questions that you might have, and we certainly would respectfully request your approval of this amendment to the water appeal. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. And thank you, everyone who presented. It's time I ask the board if there are any questions for the applicant.
Not right now, thank you.
Mr. Chair, I do have a couple of questions, and I think it probably begins with the correspondence dated October 19th, 2020 from the Chatfield Community Association. So this question would be directed to Mr. Pratt. Chatfield asserts that the parties to this application may not be appropriate, and also suggests that a legal determination needs to be made by the county attorney that inclusion of Dominion in the CAB is legal and appropriate. Have you reviewed that correspondence and made a determination as to those assertions?
Commissioner Layden, this is Chris Pratt with the Attorney's Office. Our office has reviewed that, as was implied in the presentation by the applicant. We have been working with them. I understand Chatfield Community Association's concerns. However, our review of this found that our 18A regulations allow any landowner to appeal the water regulations. Obviously, in this case, we have a landowner who's a participant in this application. Our regulations do not address whether there may be co-applicants of any kind in an application. And it has been the county practice in the past to allow an applicant to have additional co-applicants if they wish, or legal representatives who also come and represent them at the same time. The concerns of the Chatfield Community Authority centered on whether this would create some kind of four-way contractual relationship. Our office has determined that these regulations do not create a contractual relationship of any kind. The board is making a determination of how the regulations will apply to the landowner's property. These are regulations, not a contract. And so there are no parties to it. There is simply the government regulation of the property and the landowner who must abide by those regulations. Does that clarify your question, Commissioner? You're muted, Commissioner.
I think it does. I wanted to confirm that that legal determination, or at least legal review, had occurred, and that the inclusion of CAB and Dominion passed, or at least met with your approval. I'm hearing that it does. My second question is probably related to Mr. Connolly's comments about streamlined legal writing. I think we always appreciate that, and there's certainly a lot of value there. No doubt in reviewing Mr. Lytle's abundant correspondence, it sounds as though some of his recommendations were certainly adopted, and we've seen that, but through conversation with Mr. Pratt and others, other suggestions that Mr. Lytle offered were not accepted, or at least were reworded. Can you walk us through, or at least walk the public through, some of those specific provisions that were not included, but were perhaps streamlined for better readability?
If I could, I'd like to make one clarification. I know there was some conversation of this at the Planning Commission meeting to which I was unable to attend. I just want to clarify that although Mr. Connolly and myself have worked together and discussed and walked through several of the provisions of this agreement, our office's job in this process is to ensure that there's nothing illegal in the document and that we avoid any unnecessary legal pitfalls that could be encountered. Our job is not to determine whether it is appropriate or in the best interest of the county. That is a decision entirely for the commissioners. So I just wanted to make that clear. Our office has not approved this agreement or this amendment. Our office simply reviews it for legality.
And Mr. Layden.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Mr. Layden, I'd be happy to walk through some of the items we chose not to. So the first, I'm just going to walk briefly through Mr. Lytle's letter. So in section 1, the definition section, Mr. Lytle had suggested that we change the definition of water demand, which the definition of water demand is the amount of water that's delivered to a customer plus the amount of water that's lost to system inefficiencies through the delivery system. Mr. Lytle suggested that we add to that definition water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability. Water demand management measures are not a part of water demand itself. They are part of establishing a water demand standard. So there's a water demand standard that will be established by the CAB as part of this process. And that standard must, by statute, include demand management measures that account for hydrologic variability. So that's why we chose not to incorporate that. But there's a statutory obligation already to do that that's baked into the analysis that the board will have to conduct to determine whether this water supply is sufficient in terms of quantity, quality, and dependability. In section 2.5 of the appeal, Mr. Lytle suggested adding a few additional words or phrases, and that this is one of the submittal requirements that will come with a future development application. We had proposed having an analysis showing that the subject water rights provide a sufficient and reliable water supply for the proposed project based on the retail water provider's applicable water demand standards. Mr. Lytle first encouraged us to include a reference to storage rights with respect to the discussion of water rights. Storage rights are part and parcel of water rights. So adding storage rights is really just duplicative of the analysis that we would need to do, showing that we have the subject water rights that provide a sufficient and reliable water supply. He also suggested adding languages to provide a sufficient and reliable water supply under all foreseeable hydrologic conditions based on the priority dates of the subject water rights within Colorado's doctrine of prior appropriation. Again, the statute requires the board to evaluate this application, the future development application, for sufficiency and reliability, taking into account hydrologic variation. So our preference would be to defer again to the statutory language, which requires the board to already consider hydrologic variations. Moving through to section 4, Mr. Lytle suggested adding an additional approval criterion that would read: the reliability of a renewable water right has been analyzed and is deemed sufficient by the county based on its priority date within the Colorado System of Water Rights Administration. Again, we think that's duplicative of the approval criterion provided in the amended water appeal in section 4.2, which says the proposed water supply for the development application is adequate and feasible to ensure that water supply shortages will not occur due to variations in the hydrologic cycle, and again, taking into account the water demand of the development application. Again, that is what the statute requires the board to evaluate, is whether water supply shortages will occur due to variations in the hydrologic cycle. And so we think that the proposed additional criterion is already baked into the analysis, that we have to have a reliable renewable water right based on what this provides. Section 5.2, Mr. Lytle highlighted the last clause of section 5.2, which referred, this is dealing with the timing of infrastructure development. We say that the construction and financing of the water distribution system shall occur only at such time and in such quantity as is necessary to serve a given use or development project within the property, in the discretion of Dominion and the retail water provider, subject to reasonable review by the county. Mr. Lytle commented that the county needs the ability to verify the ability of Dominion and the CAB to provide the supply in a timely manner. Again, we believe that the county having reasonable review rights means that the county will have the ability to verify the ability of Dominion and the CAB to provide supply in a timely manner. With respect to Section 6.1, Mr. Lytle recommended that it be modified to require explicit county approval of the proposed water demand standards. Again, the water demand standards are going to be submitted with a future development application, so the county will have to necessarily approve those water demand standards in order to approve a development application. So again, that seems like duplicative language. Mr. Lytle suggested the deletion of Section 6.3. We did take that suggestion and we deleted Section 6.3. And then Mr. Lytle also suggested that we include in Section 11, which relates to rainwater harvesting. He noted that the applicants need to adjudicate and augment the use of rainwater. What we have in Section 11 is rainwater harvesting shall be permitted on the property to the extent permitted by state law. And so obviously, if it's permitted by state law, it needs to have been adjudicated and augmented. So again, we think the language already provides for that. Mr. Layden, I realize that was a bit of an exhaustive answer, but do you have any follow-up questions or clarifications?
No, I don't, Mr. Connolly. That perfectly answered my questions, and I think that thoroughness is certainly appreciated. So thank you for walking us through that.
Thank you, Ms. Connolly. Any further questions this time, Commissioner Layden?
Mr. Chair, I don't have any questions at this time.
And thank you. I'll reserve my questions for later. This time, I'll open it up for public comment and testimony regarding this application. So if anyone in the audience or anyone online, then please come forward. And Ms. Dunning, we have somebody in the audience, so if you would just hold, please.
Jan Dixon, DIXON, 4271 Mustang Circle, Sedalia. I think with some of the changes that are made that have not really actually been published, there's a little confusion, at least on my part, as to what's being proposed and what's not. First, the applicant seems to say there is no change to the application as far as their existing district, and yet they have asked for some provisions that allow them to be sort of a quasi-existing district, and there is no provision in the 18A to allow either a quasi-existing district or a new special district with special privileges of an existing district. And the second part, they talk about promises made and promises kept. One of the promises is that they would abide by the water appeal and that they would not appeal the demand standard until they had met certain data requirements, which includes 5 years of data acquisition. The applicant has also spent a lot of time talking about the water appeal as caused Dominion to put infrastructure in place ahead of water demand, costing them excess money. But Dominion chose to be a partner in WISE, and it was the WISE partners that determined the timing of the installation of their pipelines, not the water appeal and not the county. Dominion was lucky in that Castle Rock paid Dominion's WISE upfront infrastructure costs with a resolution 2014-48, allowing Dominion to spread out their costs over time. I didn't see any other WISE member getting that privilege. Dominion also chose to partner with Roxborough in their construction of the new water treatment plant, and Roxborough determined the timing of the building of the infrastructure, not the water appeal and not the county. Dominion also chose to partner with Castle Rock in the installation of the pipelines from Castle Rock to Sterling Ranch. Again, Castle Rock determined the timing of the installation of those pipelines, not the water appeal and not the county. Dominion stated that the water appeal caused Dominion to purchase excess water in ahead of demand, increasing their water costs. Sterling Ranch chose to bring multiple applications to the county for approval of houses, as they have said, years ahead of the actual building of those units. Since state law requires showing water at approval, they were required to have water for those applications. Not the water appeal, not the county requiring that. That was a state requirement. And if Sterling Ranch had submitted their applications closer to when they would actually be building the units, then they wouldn't have had to have excess water purchases at this time. As far as buying extra water, we looked at documents submitted into the county, particularly at Castle Rock and Highlands Ranch, as examples of water demand versus water supply. Castle Rock stated in one of their documents that they require 2 acre-feet per every acre-foot of demand. If you look at the supplies of Highlands Ranch, Centennial supplies Highlands Ranch with about 17,000 acre-feet a year. That's pretty much how much they use as kind of a ballpark number. And yet they have 30,000 acre-feet in their portfolio. That's about a 75% surplus of water supply over water demand. On page 26 of your staff report, Dominion states that their water supply system is one of the most robust and reliable in the state, and that they own or control up to 6,800 acre-feet of developable water supply in their water supply portfolio. And yet they say they only need 4,000 acre-feet at build-out. So if they're going to have any sort of a cushion, why are they wanting to lower the demand standards? Obviously, the residents are using less water than they predicted. They're using probably a little bit more than what was stated as a number if you look at some of the other water provider information. But if they have 6,800 acre-feet, then they don't need to reduce the water demand. They already have it, and that gives them a cushion, and that cushion is less than Highlands Ranch and less than Castle Rock's. So the water appeal, or as stated, is about ensuring that the residents of Sterling Ranch have an adequate water supply under all conditions. And it's not about the cost of Dominion doing business. As Marcus stated, they're putting their infrastructure in way ahead of their house building, and infrastructure ahead of building is just the cost of doing business. So we recommend that the water appeal be denied at this time. And if there's any question as to Mr. Lytle's comments versus Dominion's comments, maybe those should be ironed out before the water appeal is approved.
Thank you, Ms. Dixon. And as Mr. Larrett approaches, Mr. Larrett, we thank you for sending us, making your email available to the commissioners prior to meeting day. Really appreciate that, so we had that chance to review it.
Okay. Thank you very much. So Dennis Larrett, again, Larratt, 10990 North Sunshine Drive, Littleton, 80125. Representing the Chatfield Community Association. Again, we had concerns, and I appreciate Mr. Pratt addressing the concerns about the relationship of having multiple applicants on this particular application. Our view is that when you have 3 different entities applying, that the agreement for the water appeal then becomes an obligation for the 3 parties working with the county, and therefore there could be confusion. My belief is that if the only applicant were Sterling Ranch, they still have the working relationship that's not even an arm's length relationship with Dominion and the CAB, but it would keep it clean in terms of every application going forth. And those are land use applications that are direct to Sterling Ranch, not necessarily to CAB and Dominion. There are several other things in there. In the referral packet, there was a request that Dominion and CAB be considered existing districts rather than new districts. That definition, I believe, was clarified, but it needs to be a verbal commitment at this meeting, should you consider approving the water appeal, that they are not asking for you to reevaluate and reconsider those two entities as new or as existing special districts. Okay, different definitions throughout 18A as to what a new or existing district obligations are. The way they have worded several of the elements of the the water appeal create shortcuts that essentially were addressed by Mr. Lytle in his referral comments on this. And Mr. Connolly addressed those issues, but I would like to have you hear Mr. Lytle's direct words on why he selected the language that he did. In the Planning Commission hearing, I believe that the applicants were rather dismissive of Mr. Lytle, in that they said that he had pride of ownership from being a key participant in drafting 18A. May be true, but he's also the county's best expert and has the best institutional knowledge of 18A. They also argued that he wasn't an attorney. And what Mr. Pratt said earlier today, I think you should take into account, and that is that the county attorney doesn't have an obligation to do much more on this than make sure that the documents are not illegal, so that they are legal to pass forward, but they do not address issues in terms of expedience or beneficial performance for one party over the other. And I believe that's what Mr. Lytle's arguments in his referral did. In my corporate career, we used to have two teams put together on significant contractual issues, one that would argue what would happen on a pro side, one that would happen on a con side, to make sure that we didn't miss things. And you don't have that benefit in this particular process. And so for due diligence purposes, you need to listen directly to Mr. Lytle's arguments about those points. I agree with Ms. Dixon on the promises made, promises kept. The outline for how the review of demand standards would work was best outlined in Mr. Lytle's February 4th, 2010 letter that outlines how the review of the demand standard would work, how the statistics work, and why it would be done in a particular way. They are trying to shortcut those elements, and that has the potential of breaking the very first item up here, 1808-4, and it does have the potential for being detrimental to future inhabitants of the county. So I think you need to look at reviewing that, and their change for the CAB to be able to reestablish demand standards looks like a shortcut.
Mr. Laird, it's been about 5 minutes, and I do plan to have Mr. Lytle come up, so maybe you don't necessarily have to refer to that, but if you have some formative comments, we'd like to hear those.
Okay.
But if you might wrap it up a little bit.
I appreciate that. I think we normally get 6 on these. So I guess the last item is that you pay Mr. Lytle to review documents for you, which we very much appreciate. And we concur with his comments and think that they do the best job of protecting current and existing citizens in the county. And we recommend against approval of the shortcuts that are included in these water demand, or the water appeal amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Laird. Anyone else in the room like to address the board? Seeing no one, I'll ask Ms. Dunning, anyone online to address the board for public comment?
Thank you, Commissioner. I have no hands raised.
Very well. At this time, I will close the public comment time. And I'm going to suggest we take about, it'll roughly be about 8-minute break. Take a recess until 4:20 p.m. sun's almost down. I know. Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, you know, it gets dark, you have dinner, and you're going, geez, 6:30, I'm hungry again.
How do we start?
So do you think I call Bruce up or have him answer some questions? Okay.
We are live and recording.
All right, let's go ahead and reconvene, call us back to order, 4:20 p.m. At this time, I'm going to ask Mr. Bruce Lytle to address the board. I believe the board has some particular questions, and Mr. Lytle, certainly you may have more to offer besides our particular questions as we work into this. But I'll first ask if there are any particular questions from the board for Mr. Lytle first.
So, Mr. Lytle, thank you for being here. I went through the packet when I was reading it, and there's a letter that you have written dated, is it February 4th? Anyway, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Thomas. I'm going to ask Mr. Lytle to state his name,
sorry.
last name and address for the record, and so the audience knows.
Bruce Lytle, L-Y-T-L-E, Lytle Water Solutions. My business address, my inactive business address, 640 Plaza Drive, Suite 170, Highlands Ranch, 80129.
I like how you put that, Mr. Lytle, because I imagine it's Zoom calls, as we just had mentioned when I ran into you.
Yes.
Commissioner Thomas, proceed, please.
So you have written a lot of information about all of this throughout the packet. So I would just like for you to explain to the board all of your concerns, things that you like about this, concerns that you have about the water appeal that's before us. Does that make sense?
Sure, I can do that.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Commissioner. So I would agree that I think that some streamlining of the original appeal is a good thing. It is a fairly long, fairly complex, somewhat redundant document. As I recall, I think we put together a lot of this in an upstairs office while the hearing was being adjourned. So it maybe didn't get as much attention as it deserved at the time. So I do agree that I think streamlining the appeal is probably a good thing. As far as issues that we have, I think that I really detailed them in my September 30 letter. And if you'd like, I can walk through that and why I made these comments.
I would appreciate that, having it on the on the oral record here.
And Mr. Connolly has gone through this, and so basically I'm going to go back through it, but I may have a different opinion than Mr. Connolly did. So on the first one, on the definitions of water demand, Mr. Connolly said that water demand is just the definition of water demand, which is the uses plus the losses. And I disagree with that in the original appeal, that was not the definition of water demand. In the original appeal, the water demand definition included a system security factor, which would be allowing for variability in demand. And so that's what I really tried to do here is I was doing something similar to what's in the original water appeal. And not only that, but to me, the definition of water demand is what goes into constructing water demand standards. And so when you're doing a water demand standards, you have to look at use, you have to look at losses, and you have to look at variability, predicted variability in that demand. And so that's why I think that the definition of water demand should be as what I have suggested here. The next one is section 2.5, where I have included some more, what I would call more explicit language of the evaluation of water rights. And Mr. Connolly mentioned that this is covered in statutory language, and so it's not necessary. My feeling is when I am asked to review an application by Sterling Ranch, this is the document. If the original appeal stays in place or this amended appeal gets approved, this is the document I'm going to go to in terms of what are the parameters that are being evaluated and how do I evaluate it. So what I was doing in section 2.5 is just being more explicit. I don't think it's confusing. I think it's just explicit, and I think it's important that it be explicit because I'm not going to go back to a statute and check a statute. I'm going to look at the four corners of the language that's in this amended appeal. And so I would suggest that you keep or you add the language that I'm suggesting in section 2.5. In section 4 of the amended appeal, there are 3 approval standards. And simply what I was doing here is in 18A, there are 4 approval standards. And so I'm just recommending that 4th approval standard be included. And variations, I think Mr. Connolly said that variations in the hydrologic cycle have already covered this, and so it's not necessary. That's not true. Changes in the hydrologic cycle are not the same as the priority date. You could be in or out of priority. You could be out of priority in a wet year, for example. So having this and having it be consistent with 18A, to me, again, is not confusing. It's being consistent with 18A, and it is a different parameter than the hydrologic cycle. So again, I would recommend that this be added as the 4th approval criteria in section 4. In section 5.2, really what I was pointing out here, and this is one that I really do understand the concern here, is not being required to put in infrastructure long before it's needed. But what I am saying here is, to me, there's a difference in the types of infrastructure that are being needed for this particular development. So there's very simple ones like installation of Denver Basin wells. To me, that's a very simple, straightforward thing. For example, with the Cherokee water, the water is adjudicated. They can easily get a permit. They can drill the well. That can be added at any time before that demand occurs. As opposed to, for example, the FSC IGA with Castle Rock, where now we're looking at wheeling water through Castle Rock, getting it up to Sterling Ranch. Until it's completed, there's a bridge agreement with Aurora that's got a finite time frame on it. So it's a much more complex kind of an infrastructure need and ability to serve. And so to me, there could be or should be maybe some differentiation relative to the infrastructure and the timing of it, as related to the simplicity of it versus the complexity of it. So I'll be glad to answer any questions you have about that one, but that's kind of my feeling. I wasn't really suggesting any alternative language here. I was just pointing out that I think that there should be some flexibility in the requirement for infrastructure based on what that infrastructure is. The next one is section 6.1, the water demand standards. My biggest comment on this is it's somewhat generic in that it talks about providing supporting evidence. Again, this is the document that if it's approved that I will go to for future applications. And so I wanted to make it clear that if a revised water demand standard is being proposed, that the raw data that support that are provided to us. For example, we've been provided a report here recently that just summarized the data. Well, I don't have any idea what the skew on that data is, the variability, the mean, the median, the mode, all those kinds of statistics. So I really would want to see the statistics, all of the data, so that we could independently verify whether we agree with the data that are being presented. So that really is my main comment there, although the original appeal required, well, let me back up. So the original appeal allowed a 47% decrease in the presumptive water demand from 0.75 to 0.4. And that really was based a lot on the commitments that Sterling Ranch made, and you've heard about today about indoor metering, outdoor metering, budgets, those kinds of things. And so that was really one of the main driving factors that I think allowed that appeal to be approved. But in section 4.5 of the appeal, there is the means to adjust it beyond that 0.4. But it was based on providing pretty significant data. There's, I think, 4 or 5 categories. There's single-family attached, single-family detached, multifamily, commercial, and irrigation that had a minimum standard that had to be met. And for most of them, it was a minimum of 100 homes with 5 years of data. So right now, what's being asked here is to basically set aside that parameter, and that parameter was set in there so that we would have a sufficient amount of data over a sufficient amount of time. And the big deal is that sufficient amount of time, because you can't replace that, because you do have wet years, dry years, as you all know. We all live in Colorado. We know that you can never depend on the amount of precipitation, the amount of snow we're going to get. And so we wanted to look at least enough years to get that a good handle on that variability. And so this is being asked to change it after 2 years. In fact, for some of these parameters or some of these, what do we call them, the units, like multifamily units, they don't have even 100 homes for 2 years, much less 5 years. And so to me, it makes it premature, but I'll leave that for another time, because we're not actually talking about changing the standard here. It's just really the concept, but I did want to mention that. My next one was on 6.3, and they've taken 6.3 out to my knowledge, and so obviously that's a moot point since that's been taken out. Probably my least objectionable comment as far as making any changes would be section 11 on the rainwater harvesting. I guess I would probably agree with Mr. Connolly that it says that they would have to the extent permitted by state law. So that would include an augmentation plan. I was just pointing out that rainwater harvesting is not going to be a firm water supply, and it isn't going to be available until an augmentation plan is adjudicated. I was not necessarily recommending any changes in that language. And I think those were the main comments that I had and changes that I would propose in the document. And like I say, I don't think that any of my proposed language changes are confusing or convoluted. I think they just make it very explicit. And again, this will be the document, if it's approved, that I will be reviewing. And so I don't want to have to be going and checking against other documents. This will be the document that's going to guide any reviews in the future.
So I'm going to digest this, what you just said, for a while. If Commissioner Layden or Commissioner Partridge have some questions, the floor is theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Commissioner Layden.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Lytle, as always, for your expertise in providing some insight I think that really helps me as well. My question was similar, as if whether you could just walk through some of these outstanding comments that you had. So I think I have what I need. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Layden.
Thank you, Commissioner Layden.
And I will say it was, Mr. Lytle, thank you for your digestion of that, because it certainly is a lot of information, but I really appreciate the clarification and understanding of what was being presented to us would be a document for us to look at, a new document to analyze and understand. So I think you bring up some excellent points. I think you've answered my questions as to what we have presented today. I think I may have more, but I want to give Commissioner Thomas a chance if she has anything else, and then I certainly want to have the applicant address some of the issues we've heard in public comment and your comments.
I don't have anything else. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lytle. This time, Mr. Smethels or Ms. Connolly or anyone on your team, you'd like to address the questions that are raised in public comment and Mr. Lytle's comment, though.
Sorry if we sidebar for just a second.
You bet. Take your time.
Thanks for the minute there.
You bet.
Again, Commissioners, Brian Connolly for the applicant. I want to just read you the relevant section of the state statute that we've been referencing, because I think it will probably help you in considering this application. So, and I'm going to read the definition of adequate. So this is from Title 29, Article 20, Part 3 of the Colorado Revised Statutes, and that the county has an obligation with any given development application to determine that the water supply is adequate. And so the definition of adequate is adequate means a water supply that will be sufficient for the build out of the proposed development in terms of quality, quantity, dependability, and availability to provide a supply of water for the type of development proposed, and may include reasonable conservation measures and water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability. So that is what the county's job is with any development application. And what we're trying to do with this water appeal is to hew as closely to that as possible, to make sure that you have the information necessary to make a determination as to whether the water supply has a quality, quantity, dependability, and availability to supply the development that is proposed. So with that definition in mind, I just want to respond to the few items that were raised by Mr. Lytle. He noted, that the definition of water demand, I think his rationale for including the third prong of water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability, that was in the original appeal. Well, we're trying to amend the original appeal to streamline it. And again, that obligation to ensure that hydrologic variability is accounted for is not a question of what the water demand is, it's a question of the county's evaluation of water supply. And so the approval criteria that we have and the submittal requirements that we've put in the water appeal are to ensure that you have the information to determine, again, that the water supply is sufficient in terms of quality, quantity, dependability, and availability, which it may include reasonable conservation measures and water demand management measures to account for that hydrologic variability. So that's already an obligation of the counties. That's already baked into the approval criteria that we've provided in the water appeal, which is why we just don't think it's appropriate to include that in the definition of water demand, which is a question of how much water is actually being demanded by the community. His reference to, Mr. Lytle's reference to section 2.5, what he wants us to include is an analysis showing that the subject water rights, including storage if applicable, I think he agreed that storage rights are water rights, provide a sufficient and reliable water supply under all foreseeable hydrologic conditions based on the priority dates of the subject water rights within Colorado's doctrine of prior appropriation. That goes above what the statute calls for. What the statute calls for is, again, water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability. We'll do that. We'll provide that data and that information to support how our demand standards match up with providing for hydrologic variability. That's different, though, from under all foreseeable hydrologic conditions based on the priority dates of the subject water rights within Colorado's doctrine of prior appropriation. That's not an accurate statement of what the law is. With respect to the approval standards, the third item the fourth item that Mr. Lytle wanted to add into the approval standards were the reliability of a renewable water right has been analyzed and deemed sufficient based on priority date within the Colorado System of Water Rights Administration. Many of the renewable water rights that are associated with, that are in Dominion's portfolio are leased water rights. And so therefore, they're not even, the lease is not necessarily in the System of Water Rights Administration. So this isn't really even applicable to some of the renewable water rights that are associated with this. Again, the county's obligation is to evaluate quantity, quality, and dependability. So inherently in evaluating dependability, you're going to evaluate whether you have a senior right or a junior right and whether that is dependable for purposes of the application that's coming before you. Mr. Lytle noted that with respect to the infrastructure, he wanted to ensure that the county had the flexibility to require some infrastructure earlier to the extent that infrastructure is needed. I think we've provided for that in that we are saying that if infrastructure is necessary to serve a given use or development project within the property, in the discretion of Dominion and CAB and subject to review by the county, then that infrastructure would be required. So again, I think that provision, what I heard, and I mean, if I misspeak, I'm sure Mr. Lytle can correct me. What I heard, though, is that I think we have the language that provides that flexibility here. Mr. Lytle also noted that if the demand standard is being amended, he wanted to ensure that the county had data to evaluate the amended demand standard. And I'm just going to flip down to our water appeal document. We have in our water appeal reference to the amendment to the demand standards. And so what we provide is that the written demand standards may be amended from time to time, and then if the demand standard changes, the resolution that adopts that demand standard from the CAB and all the supporting evidence would need to be resubmitted to the county as part of our submittal requirements. So in other words, the CAB will adopt a demand standard. It will give you a bunch of evidence that support why it's adopting that demand standard with the first, let's say the first development application that comes in after this appeal, after we hope it's approved. After it's approved, there'll be a resolution setting a demand standard with a bunch of supporting evidence. And so what this provides is if that changes, then a new resolution will come to you with the next development application that will have all of that supporting evidence, again, supporting that that amended demand standard. So I think we've provided for that within the appeal document. Mr. Lytle made comments about, that this is setting aside the parameters that were set by the original water appeal today and that we're doing that prematurely. I would note that Mr. Lytle acknowledged that, with the next development application that comes in as defined under this, we would bring forth that demand standard. That's probably a better time to have the debate about whether we're changing the parameters or whether it's appropriate to change the parameters. I would just reiterate that the overriding purpose of this appeal is to ensure that we are being efficient in our provision of water to this community. And what has been observed thus far is that even with just 2 years of data, is that this has been particularly onerous on the existing ratepayers in the community. It's basically, they're doing a great job conserving water, but they're being charged much higher rates because of the amount of water, additional water that they need to reserve. You heard about flushing the system and inefficiencies that are created by the existing water appeal. So while I understand the sentiment that this is changing some of the parameters that were agreed to in the 2013 water appeal, we're bringing that forth because we think, based on the data that we have already, it's an appropriate time to change those parameters, or at least allow you to consider changing those parameters with a future development application.
This is Brock Sneffels, SMETHILS, with the applicant. I did want to just briefly go through at least the first 3 items as well, to Brian's point, more on a practical side. So section 1, Bruce originally wanted to add security factors to the definition, and we have proposed to add water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability. Again, that account for water demand management measures to account for hydrologic variability was taken directly out of statute. And so Mr. Lytle didn't like that, but we pulled it directly out of the state statute. The second piece of this is that we have a little bit of a unique setup of how these districts function together. Generally speaking, Centennial Water and Sanitation District, Parker Water and Sanitation District, and the town of Castle Rock are all wholesale and retail providers in one, in the sense that they're both generating the water either through drilling the aquifer or collecting renewable water and then delivering it to retail customers. What we have in the CAB and Dominion is a different scenario where Dominion is a wholesale provider and CAB is a retail provider. And Bruce wanted to, oftentimes water providers would build in hydrologic variation into their water demand standards when they are both a wholesale and retail provider to customers. What's unique in this situation is that the CAB ultimately is just delivering water from literally the water treatment plant on site to retail providers. And in order to come up with these water demand standards, what is really being looked for is what is actual consumption and what is lost through that delivery system. And then at every application that has been submitted to the county, Dominion is actually doing an analysis already to look at the firm yield delivery of the water on the wholesale side. And so by adding in an additional security factor to deal with hydrologic variability, specifically on the demand side, Dominion is being required to already address that in each of these development applications and has been required to address that with Mr. Lytle in each of these applications. So it's creating a system of redundancy where there's factors of safety built into the demand, and then there's also factors of safety built into the supply that ultimately means that more water, again, is reserved than will ever be used when predominantly most of Dominion's water supplies are being required to be firm yield anyways. So that was specific with the water demand definition. That was the logic of how and why it was crafted and changed from the existing appeal. Section 2.5, an analysis showing the subject water rights provide a sufficient reliable water supply. An analysis showing that the subject water rights, including storage if applicable, under all foreseeable hydrologic conditions. Again, that standard is above and beyond statute. Most renewable water providers can't meet they cannot guarantee that they will be able to provide customers under any foreseeable hydrologic condition. If there is a prolonged drought, different districts have to take into account different measures. Aurora being an example, they have their own drought plan where once reservoirs hit certain levels, they actually start forced curtailment of customers, as an example. And so we just thought that under all foreseeable hydrologic conditions was just a burden that was above and beyond what the statutes require. It's also a burden that's above and beyond pretty much what any other water district in the state is required to meet. And then on, just on section 4, there are 4 approval criteria in 18A, and one of them was omitted from this appeal. The one that was omitted is the reliability of a renewable water right has been analyzed and is deemed sufficient by the county based on its priority date within Colorado System Water Rights Administration. The reason that was removed is that WISE itself is a permanent lease of water between the South Metro Water Supply Authority and Denver and Aurora. That is the largest single renewable water right, along with the 250 acre-foot agreement with Aurora and the 230 acre-foot agreement with Aurora. All of those are permanent leases of water from another jurisdiction. And our concern was, and again, the whole purpose of this appeal was to streamline the review process, was that with a permanent lease of renewable water, how would that fit into the Colorado System of Water Rights Administration? And again, to Bruce's point, this is the document that we would be held to. Staff would then, and Lytle would be asked, how do we fit a square peg into a round hole? If a renewable water right that Dominion owns is to be used for a water supply, this analysis that is part of the approval criteria would have to be submitted in order to show that it's a firm yield right, or if it's not a firm yield right, how and when it could be used. And that's already built into the appeal. So with those 3 in particular, I really just wanted to kind of walk through the thought process, and it was determined, we understand Mr. Lytle's concerns. We feel that there's reason and rational basis to go with the appeal as drafted. So, thank you for that.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Smethels. I think we probably have some additional questions, and I'll turn to commissioners for additional questions this time.
I don't have any additional questions.
You know, I do, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate Mr. Connolly and Mr. Smethels providing that additional input and some background. Mr. Lytle spoke specifically to needing some additional raw data under 6.1. And I know you spoke to that a bit, but can you provide a little bit more clarity? And I'm asking the applicant if there's some rationale why more of that raw data could not be provided.
This is Brock Smethels on behalf of the applicant, SMETHILLS. Yeah, to Brian's point, again, the language here matters, and our concern was saying specifically raw data being included as part of what's submitted from the CAB for approval. We thought it was actually broader to say that a reasonable justification would be submitted, or terms along that kind of in that direction. Ultimately, I believe, and I have Mary Kay looking this up in the original appeal, it did require the 5 years of 100 homes worth of data. I do believe, though, under the original appeal that supplemental districts data could also be submitted as evidence for changing the water demand. And some of the usage data that I showed earlier in my presentation illustrates that other districts, particularly districts with newer homes, are seeing a decline in demand, predominantly for a lot of the same reasons the CAB is. Even without implementing dual water metering, the state has, for the most part, outlawed the ongoing use of high water use fixtures. And so we're seeing indoor demand go down across the Denver metro area. If Mr. Lytle wants to see raw data, that's something that could be reviewed during a development application. We just didn't feel the need to clearly define saying, the CAB's raw customer usage data would be provided to Douglas County. That's information that the CAB has to actually be very careful in how it's administered and garnered. That's personal information of homeowners. And so that could be requested, but we felt it wasn't necessary to put it into the document in the appeal itself, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smethels.
And Brian Connolly would like to speak as well.
Mr. Connolly, Mr. Smithles, if you'd feel comfortable, you could have a seat there and share the microphone back and forth, and instead of necessarily having to come up one at a time. Feel free to do that too. Probably have to turn that microphone on there, Mr. Connolly. It's on.
Yes, it sounds like it's on. Commissioner Layden, the other thing I would just offer is that what Section 6.1 says is that any such determination of water demand standards shall be based on supporting evidence, and the board, meaning the Board of County Commissioners, may request documentation of such evidence as necessary to allow the board to evaluate the adequacy of the water supply. So I think if raw water use data was something that the board wanted to see as part of evaluating a water demand standard, then it would have the authority to do that.
That's helpful, Mr. Connolly. What I heard from Mr. Lytle is that in his review of any future application, it might be helpful for him to have access to that raw data. And so is it your interpretation of the language as you've presented it, that there would be anything that would inhibit Mr. Lytle from requesting or obtaining that information?
Certainly, I don't think there's anything that's inhibiting from requesting that. I think the only thing that we would be concerned about is any proprietary or privacy concerns. But I don't read that section as inhibiting that. No.
Well, I heard Mr. Smethles mention that as well. Can you help me understand how providing raw water usage data would be proprietary or personal in any way?
Yes. So, for example, the CAB's water data is actually reported by address. And so, in theory, that's personal consumer information, depending on how it was reviewed. The analysis that the CAB has submitted in to date was anonymized to keep that from being customer-specific information. Again, under the right circumstances and under the right, confidentiality, I'm sure that there would be the opportunity for Lytle to review that data should the board request it. But again, there is some customer-specific information in that data, and that's why it wasn't just submitted with here's a list of addresses, here's how much water they use. So.
Okay, thank you.
So as I've been sitting here listening and reading and everything I read over the weekend, there's a lot of things here that I'm not clear on enough to make a decision right now. I will tell you that I think streamlining is a good thing, and I really do want to help ratepayers. That if ratepayers are paying more than they are using, then if there's an ability for government to reduce that cost to them, that's a good thing. Here are the two real issues for me right now. And the first one was the explanation in 6.1 that we got some information, but as Mr. Lytle explained, the actual data wasn't clearly provided. And I took statistics. I bet a lot of people in this room took statistics. And it was a painful class, but it helped me understand the meaning of words like mean and average. And it sounds like Mr. Lytle is saying that that is the data that he needs to see to make good advice and recommendations to the county. The other issue he talked about was 4.5. And as I understood him, he said that the standard was 0.75 acre feet, and it was dropped to 0.4 acre feet. And in this water appeal, there was the understanding that in order for it to be reduced further, the data would be necessary for 100 homes for 5 years of data. So I need to understand if that is true, because if that is true, then we're not there yet. And so those are two huge questions I have, because as I look at the approval standards here, the .072 talks about data. And so what I would like to suggest to my fellow commissioners, if they would be willing to support I always get these words wrong, a continuance? So the attorney is shaking his head. I picked the right word up. So that we can, at least I can be more clear in what I'm determining here, because I have a lot of questions still, and I'm sorry. I really do want to benefit the ratepayers, but I want to make sure we're making the right decision as well.
Commissioner Thomas, some of the points you raised, were those specific questions you'd like the applicant to address or staff to address right now?
They can address them if they want, but those are questions in my mind, and I don't know how they're going to change those questions I have.
Okay. I would just give you, hearing Commissioner Thomas's questions, concerns there, I'll certainly let the applicant respond.
Yeah, sure. So I think with respect to the first, your first concern, Commissioner Thomas, I think, if it would make you feel more comfortable to put it in section 6.1, that, and I'll just make sure I've got it in front of me because I don't want to draft off the top of my head, but if you wanted to put some language in section 6.1 where any such determination of water demand standards shall be based on supporting evidence, which may include...
Mr. Conley, would you mind scooting the microphone closer? I think some in the audience are having
Yep.
trouble hearing. Thank you.
I mean, we would be willing to change the language of section 6.1 to say that any such determination of water demand standards shall be based on supporting evidence, which shall include but is not limited to anonymized raw water data or something like that. If that would help alleviate that concern that we specifically reference raw water data. Mr. Lytle's letter did not suggest that we modify the language to include that. So I mean, that's fine. If that's a concern of yours that we're providing specifically in there that raw water data will be provided, that's not a problem. With respect to your second concern about the 5 years of data, that was a requirement of the 2013 water appeal. And so what we are trying to do right now with the application that's before you is to establish a process by which we can bring a new demand standard to you with a future development application. We're not changing any water demand standards today. That would come later down the road. But it may be in advance of the 5 years of data. Again, the point being that we feel like we've got data now to present to you, at which point then you will have the opportunity to evaluate whether that data supports reducing the demand standard from what it is today. And if it doesn't, then the water demand standard that's in place today would remain in effect. Is that clear?
Well, I think I understood that when we started all of this on page 53 of the packet, it says, staff and applicant have clarified that this request does not establish any demand standard. Rather, it allows for the CAB to establish a demand standard to be reviewed by the county as part of any specific development application. So that's what you're saying, that if this board approves this today, that all the water standards, that are in place right now will stay, nothing will change, but that each additional filing could have different requirements for the water you bring with the application.
That's correct. And when those filings come before you, they will need the demand standard that is established for those filings will need to be supported by, if we include the language that I just suggested, raw water use data, along with any other evidence that you as a board and that your staff feel is appropriate to support the change in that demand standard.
And in order to answer that question, I'm going to have to ask Mr. Lytle his opinion on this, because he is the expert to tell us what this means, because I don't know what this means. So is that okay, Mr. Chair? Mr. Lytle, could you come forward, please? So I explained the two issues that I really have concerns with, and the applicant has made an additional proposal. So with the, perhaps the additional proposal they have offered, does that solve either, I think we're talking about 6.1 and 4.5?
Yeah, I certainly agree that in 6.1, if we add the language about the raw data, that obviously takes care of that. And I agree that this amended appeal does not in itself allow them to change the demand standard. What it does is it sets up the process. So they still will have to come back with a specific application and present that data and say, we want to apply this demand standard instead of 0.4. So that's not being determined tonight. They will still be at 0.4 after tonight.
Okay. And the question in the original water appeal said that anything that, this is what I'm understanding from what you said, that in order to change the requirement from 0.4, there would have to be 5 years of data and 100 homes worth of data to consider. Was that in the original water appeal?
Yes, there's a table in section 4.5, and it's for a number of different types of use. So they have to provide 100 homes and 5 years of data for single-family attached, another 100 for single-family detached, another 100 for multifamily, and then there's something about commercial and irrigation. It's a little different because obviously it's not quite the same. So there's 5 different categories, I believe, and it's in the table in section 4.5 of the original appeal. And so that amount of data had to be provided before consideration of an adjusted demand standard.
And was that appeal a law? Was it a court decree? Was that something that a previous board agreed to?
Yeah, it's the appeal that the previous commissioners agreed to in 2013. So it's the document that I use. So for example, it's got the 0.4 in there. It's got all the other demand standards that are different than the presumptive demand standards in 18A. And of course, it's got a whole lot of other stuff in there too. But that's the document generally that I look at when Sterling Ranch comes in with a filing. That's the document I look at to evaluate that application.
So in other words, if we approve this today, we haven't changed any standards going forward, but what it means is every application that comes before us from now on will have this water appeal or this water demand standard that the board also has to agree to with that application. Is that what we're doing?
Right. When they come in, well, I mean, there's already one on the on the books. Filing 6 has been filed, and they've requested an adjusted demand standard in that filing. So, yes, going forward, what's going to happen is that they may come in with data saying these are what we think are the demands for single-family attached, detached, multifamily, whatever is in the application, and then that will be applied to whatever the application is, however many homes and acres of irrigation, things like that.
So this question is for Mr. Pratt. So this 2013 water appeal was approved by a prior board, and that board cannot impose standards on this board. So there is really nothing that would stop this board from approving this request before us today, even though we don't have 5 years worth of data.
I would say that is correct. The previous board made a determination that that would probably be in the best interests of the county, and so made that a rule for this property. That's why it's an amendment only for this property, not for all properties, this is not a change of 18A, but it's a change for how 18A is applied to this particular property. And they determined that a 5-year, 100 homes in all of these different instances would be the best way to go forward. You are not bound by that. This appeal is the process for you to determine whether you wish to continue that, make it stricter, or, as the applicant has requested, relax it.
Thank you.
And Commissioner Thomas, I was just going to add that I think to maybe put a finer point on the whole 5-year issue is that the current water appeal, the one that was approved by a prior board in 2013, fixes the time frame and says, Sterling Ranch can't come to you before that 5-year period and ask for a change in the demand standard, right? And it sets forth a process for how to do that. We're just asking for the ability to come to you before that 5-year period with the process that's set up in the water appeal document that's in front of you today. Come to you before that 5-year period is up and bring you whatever supporting data we've got for you to make a decision as to whether that demand standard is appropriate.
This is Brock Swindles. I believe the previous appeal, and Marion Kay is looking at it right now, but also allowed us to petition before the 5-year period. It's just at 5 years, there was kind of a standard way to automatically recalculate the water demands based on perceived usage or noted usage in Sterling Ranch. But again, I believe we had, under that appeal, the option to come back at any time to the board and present a different methodology to calculate the water demands in Sterling Ranch. And I'm not entirely sure that each product or each residential type was treated separately needing 100 homes. It was kind of not perfectly defined, saying that after 100 homes usage of data, there's a way to automatically recalculate water demands. And to your point earlier about you taking statistics, the current appeal was very conservative in the sense that it required that the 97.27 percentile of highest water users be captured in the new water demand. So in effect, it actually rewarded those who use way more water than the average. And the numbers that I presented earlier in my slides were average water consumption per residential unit in Castle Rock, Parker, and Centennial Water. The current appeal would require that average. That wouldn't be a good enough water demand. You'd have to use the 97th percentile of highest water users to come up with a water demand. So you'd effectively be disincentivizing any kind of water conservation. So just the old appeal wasn't perfect. That's one of the reasons we're here today, to try and streamline this process, give us a better way to present water demands in the future.
If I may, Commissioner, I'd also like to clarify something I heard said in the last back and forth. This appeal would not require the applicant to always have the water demand standard reviewed by this board. They have two options that would not require that. One, to continue with the 0.4 that they're currently under, or two, once a demand standard is approved for a future application that's lower than 0.4, that demand standard would be considered approved for all future applications. And unless they changed it, it would be the new demand standard going forward. That is how this appeal is set up, just to clarify that. They do not necessarily have to come and prove the demand standard at each and every application, but if they're going to lower it or change it substantially, or if there's been a substantial change of some kind, they have to demonstrate how this new demand standard is adequate. And that would be up to you, the board, to determine whether it was adequate. But it's also in this appeal that once the county has approved a demand standard, that demand standard is set and is considered adequate for all future applications, just to be clear.
Thank you.
Okay. Further comments to Commissioner Thomas's questions, comments?
If I could just clarify one thing that may be confusing is that you're not deciding tonight whether 5 years of data or 2 years of data are adequate, that you're going to get the shot at that at the first time that that's asked for. So that's not, that particular issue is not before you. So whether we think that 2 years of data is sufficient instead of 5, that's still an open question.
Thank you.
Very well.
And I would add with Mr. Pratt's comment that there is some doubt relative to once a demand standard has been accepted, that it never has to be looked at again. Because again, water demands vary.
Thank you. I have some particular questions for staff. We have not heard from staff. I'm going to ask staff a couple of questions, specifically in our staff report on page 7 for the staff comments on 1808, A07, 2, and 3. So I'd like to have staff, feel free to give us some analysis. You give us commentary there on these criteria, I'd like you to address that. I would like to hear a little bit from staff.
Commissioner Partridge, are you talking about the approval standards discussion? Yes. Okay. For 2 and for 3?
Yes.
Or for 1 and for 2?
Correct.
Okay. Well, for 2, it's talking about whether the application provides sufficient supporting data of alternative water demand criteria so that the water supply is still considered sufficient in terms of quantity, quality, and dependability. And our analysis of that was that the amended appeal doesn't actually establish a specific water demand process. It allows the CAB with the opportunity to propose a demand standard that would be evaluated by the county at the time of each development application. So in that sense, we believe that that standard had limited applicability, or certainly wasn't unmet, because it's not establishing, we're not evaluating data at this time. We will be evaluating data at the time of the development application. So
Right.
That's how we viewed that approval standard.
Right, now just comment on that, because this is what I see. It's, the request is not for setting a specific water demand standard. We've had that, I think it's clarified, and I think everybody understands that. But as I read the criteria, I have some concerns, because right now the CAB has the ability to set a water demand standard. They have that ability to do that. It's just if it's going to be used in an application. So that's what's in question, I think, that I have. That's what I want to raise in that particular criteria. It's not that the CAB can't do it, it's just that if an application should come forward, the CAB would then give water demand standards. And then for any comments on 073.
Well, in a sense, we believe this wasn't applicable because they're not changing the timing of the determination of water supply adequacy. That occurs at the time of preliminary plan or, minor development plat, and so nothing in this appeal is changing that, the timing of when the determination is made.
Very well, thank you. Yes, Ms. Bessels.
And as the applicant, I managed to find in the old appeal certain sections that I thought would be important. The 5-year period for project sector that Bruce discussed is in there. It says that a retail provider can request after that time to establish an adjusted water demand. But it also says reset at other times, and it says in addition to those times described in sections 4.5 and 4.5B1 and 4.5B2, an adjusted water demand standard for any project sector may be established in the manner set forth herein at any other time upon agreement of the county and dominion. So it was already built into the old appeal that at any time a request could be made for any project sector to change the demand standards. What's different with this application for the 2020 water appeal is just that the CAB will now use its own data to create those standards, and then the board will have the authorization, or will have the ability to look at it and deem if it's sufficient or not, or if the current demands are sufficient with each project application. So I just wanted to put that in the record.
Thank you. Commissioner Layden, any further questions? Any further questions?
No further questions, but maybe a few comments. Just to step back a bit, I know early on in the presentation, a reference was made to Joy Burns and her legacy, and I just want to make sure that we acknowledge that and acknowledge her passing. I think we're all familiar enough with Sterling Ranch to affirm that Joy, in fact, does reside in this area, if not physically, then certainly metaphorically. So appreciate that reference and our condolences to her family and friends. I do think it's important from a quasi-judicial capacity that we're in this evening to make it clear what is before us. And I think it's been reiterated several times, but we're not talking about demand standards, simply about an amended appeal, understanding that demands will be considered with a future development application. I am philosophically, and I think consistent with our approval standards, in favor of streamlining, not in favor of omitting. I think that would be a violation of 1808A.071 with regard to future inhabitants. So I like streamlining, but we don't want to omit. And I'm certainly in favor of right sizing. I think Ms. Provoznik shared that with us. I would certainly agree that the process needs to be right sized. And we never want to be overburdensome to our business community in a way that's not fair to them or limits their ability to be successful in our community. But the flip side is we also don't want to underserve, which also would be an issue for future inhabitants. I appreciate the concession by Mr. Connolly and Mr. Smethels with regard to raw data. I just want to make sure that was adequately captured in the process. I'm sure staff captured that, but I do think that's helpful to ensure that while there may be errors of omission, we always prefer errors of commission over errors of omission. So getting more of that data, I think, is important. We heard that from Mr. Lytle. And ultimately, we're going to be relying on Mr. Lytle in the future as applicants are reviewed by him, and we're hearing from these applicants in the future. So I would have to say that initially, I think because of the dearth of information we received, I was in a position of perhaps continuance to hear more and process, but I'm feeling more confident based upon the information provided by the applicant that what's before us today makes sense. I guess I'd be curious to hear more from you, Commissioner Partridge, in terms of your thoughts, but I'm less persuaded to continue and more persuaded to approve this particular application this evening.
So before I have comments, I would some clarity, and I would ask for Attorney Pratt. As we look at, oops, I just lost it. Anyways, there it is on the screen, 1808A.072. Can you help me with halfway through after 1806A, where it states the application provides sufficient supporting data of alternative or alternate water demand criteria, ... We don't have an application in front of us per se. So can you help me with this criteria, the standard?
I would, certainly, Commissioner, I would say that criteria would apply specifically if someone was asking for a specific water demand standard to be applied in this instance, as was the case back in 2013 when a 0.4 was requested. They had to have supporting documentation to prove why that was adequate at that time. In this case, we have a unique situation where the applicant is asking for a process to be set forth that ensures that this is done before any such water demand standard is approved. So the decision for the commissioners to make tonight would be, does this appeal provide a process sufficient that supporting data of alternate water demand criteria can be considered sufficient in terms of quantity, quality, and dependability for future applications? If there is doubt in your mind about whether this process, as laid out in this application, would do that, then I would submit that you should deny this request. If you feel that this process would allow that for any future application that changes the water demand standard, then you can approve this appeal. Does that make sense, Commissioner?
Right. So I'll submit to my fellow commissioners, we're we're not being provided with a water demand standard or criteria tonight. That has been established. So I gotta say, I really have a challenge with approval standard 2 here, because it's exactly what it says. I realize it's an appeal to change the appeal process, but that's what we have written in our standard. So I realize there's been a lot of information brought forward. I think there's a track going in the right way, because I've heard this, and I'm not going to say darn, I almost made it through my 8 years before we do a rework on 18A, but darn, we almost made it. But no, I do believe 18A is confusing. I think we had some great testimony to that, and redundant and, extraneous and confusing. We don't like that. So I agree the track we're going on, but I do have some challenges with our standards as we have presented to us tonight.
So Commissioner Partridge, maybe you and I are in the same vein. I do want to help streamline, and I don't want ratepayers having to pay more than they need to. That is primary and important to me. But what if we approve something? So when Mr. Smethels talked, he gave a range of 0.11 to 0.226 is what I wrote down. So what if we approve that and it's not enough water? Then what? I mean, I think that really is the question we are here to be sure of. And that's why I don't want to deny this, because I want to take care, I want to be responsive to the ratepayers. But I'm not ready to approve this. I'm wondering if we can do a continuance so that we can get more information to understand what it is we're approving.
Commissioner Thomas, I'm pretty much at that same spot too. I'm open enough to say there's something here that's being presented, but I'm not comfortable enough to say it meets your approval standards. But it may, I don't know, and I think that's why I would be willing on a continuance too to examine this a little bit more, because there's certainly a lot of information presented, a lot to understand. And I also just have the concerns, and maybe I don't, and that'll be a question I can get answered if this is continued with staff. With the other standard we have of 0.75 for all the rest of our applications we've heard or could be hearing, that I can't even tell you I can understand the question I want to ask about that, but there's something about that 0.75 that if we're going to change one appeal, another appeal would be subject to it. So I want to be very cautious of that and how we get there.
So I'd like to ask the attorney a question. That we have started this hearing, we've had public testimony, we've closed that. What format is available to us to get our questions answered? Is that one-on-one meetings with each commissioner with the county attorney, or what would this look like?
Commissioner, I would say that this matter still has to be decided in hearing, in public.
Correct.
And so if there are questions, the best format for that would be to continue this to a date certain when a public hearing, land use hearing is already scheduled, and then finish your deliberations or concerns. Then if you have concerns between here and there about things that don't make sense, in that interim, it would certainly be possible to put your questions in writing. Those can be submitted to the applicant, and the applicant can be ready to answer those questions too, I would say, in the public hearing. If you felt more comfortable doing it that way, the process still needs to play out in the public. And so one-on-one meetings, I would not advise.
Okay.
Although certainly with our office, with Lance or myself, you are welcome to have one-on-one meetings for legal questions you have at any time. but questions specific to this application that are for the applicant to answer or for staff to answer should probably still be done in the public forum. And so that's my recommendation to you. If you'd like to do a continuation, I would say we should set a date and time certain when that will be continued to. If you, in that time period from here until that meeting, you have specific questions you want to make sure the applicant is ready to answer, you certainly could put those in writing, and those staff will forward those to the applicant for you. Does that answer your question, Commissioner?
So I would like to propose that this be continued until November 24th at 1:30. Now, 1:30 is usually when we have business meetings, but county manager is listening in, and he texted me that November 24th at 1:30 looks good. Does that work for everybody else?
So I'm not sure if that's an official motion or not. I would just say for me, if we're still in discussion, that, you know, if we were talking about a demand standard, I might be concerned about 1 to 2 years of data and 180 to 300 attached lots, and whether or not that's sufficient to change the demand standard. But that's not before us today. So I feel more certain about approving, but out of respect to my fellow commissioners, I certainly hear that two would like to continue for more information. I never want to get in the way of obtaining more information. So I don't, Commissioner Thomas, is that a motion from you?
Well, I think I was looking at the applicant.
Okay.
Hearing myself twice is bad. Are the applicants available? I think that's probably the week of Thanksgiving.
I'm actually out of town that entire week. But if that's the only date that works for the commissioners, we can be flexible.
So before a motion comes forward, I'd like to have further comments, so.
Okay, I just thought we might be looking for a date, but go ahead if you have something else.
Just to state a couple of things, there's a couple other options to look at. Well, first of all, if it was a continuance, even though we closed public comment, there could be the option to open public comment if the commissioners would believe there was new information provided that would justify opening public comment. So I just always like to make that known. The other option is certainly, I know the applicants have heard the discussions and where we're going, that there certainly is I think it's really come to the point of looking at 18A, you really look at it. So there is the option versus a continuance for the applicant to actually pull the application. I'm not going to suggest you do that, but we always want to just make that as an option. Pulling the application, but I think the conversation would go on. I don't want to suggest that because that's entirely the applicant's choice, because I do think this conversation has started and there's been a lot of good information presented. And I didn't get out of office before it came, so here it is. But there's a couple options for us to consider, but I certainly see the idea about continuing so we get further analysis done. The commissioners will be limited because we will not be able to have this conversation amongst ourselves. The only time what we'd be able to do is, as Attorney Pratt said, really just to ask for clarification and understanding through our attorney's office and staff also. And I see Jeanette Barr, you raised your hand. Would you like to make a comment?
I think we've heard the discussion here today. So from a staff perspective, we can certainly talk to the applicant about what we think some of the questions are and maybe some things I was thinking maybe in that section 6 that maybe would address some of the questions and concerns that I've been hearing. But I think that's what we would do, is we would work with the applicant, because we're hearing you, and I think have a notion of kind of some of the information that you're wanting.
Right. And in that, Attorney Pratt realized the staff can still work with the applicant, but that information would not be provided to the commissioners unless it was in a public hearing.
That is correct. There would be, I imagine there could be a follow-on staff report of some kind.
If we did a supplemental
that would go
staff
on the
report,
record.
we would provide that. And the public
Summarizing
would
that
see it too.
information, perhaps, yeah. But
Yeah, and the public would see it as well if we did that.
That's correct, but the decision makers would not be involved in that process and would not be giving input in that process.
I just wanted to reiterate that in case it was not heard, if there was additional information that staff would have come forward from the applicant, or the applicant have further information that would be provided to the public prior to a hearing if we would continue.
That is correct. Everything would have to be released at least 24 hours in advance. Typically, our standard is much longer than that before the meeting.
Okay, Mr. Conley.
Yeah, and this is Brian Connolly for the applicant. I think the one thing that I would want to make sure we're clear on is what specifically the questions are. I think we sort of understand the concern. And Commissioner Partridge, hearing you speak, I mean, I think your concern is that approval criterion number 2 requires the presentation of data to change the water demand standard. And again, what we're not doing here is changing the water demand standard. We're setting forth a process by which we can give you the data to then set a water demand standard. So I think I understand your concern about the fact that there's not, because there is not data that is being presented to you. It's been offered to you as sort of example here, but that is not, we are not providing data as part of this application in asking you to approve a change to the process in terms of how that water demand standard is set. That data would be provided later. So if I want to make sure I understand the specific information that you're after, so that if we do continue this and we have to prep for another discussion, what can we bring back to you that would help you make this decision?
Right, because it's interesting because it's pretty much implied there would be an application coming forward. But what is being requested, and as I understand, is a change of our 18A appeal process.
The process, exactly.
Yeah, that's really what, so that's what makes it hard to really grasp and be able to say, I agree with all the approval standards.
Right, and I think you've heard from staff in the county attorney's office, and correct me if I'm wrong, that approval criterion number 2 may not really even apply because this is not changing the water demand standard. So if you were to find that approval criterion doesn't apply, then it's really just a question of the first one, is it consistent with the public health, safety, and welfare? I think if you were to find that criterion does apply, that number 2, that data needs to be provided, I think the question then is, does the appeal that's before you right now, does that provide you a process by which you can collect the data you need to set the demand standard?
Very well, appreciate that.
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair, and maybe a point of clarification from legal. I'm not sure that we have received that advice in the past from the county attorney's office. And I just want to ask again, why in any way would the commissioners be prevented from inquiring or making independent inquiries of staff with regard to questions they have, provided that a supplemental report from staff would be publicly available?
Well, certainly the supplemental staff would be publicly available, as would any correspondence sent to the applicant on your behalf. The advice that our office would give is, because there is some quasi-judicial nature to this hearing, the commissioners must be careful not to discuss the particulars of this case outside of the hearing. And so while it would, certainly the questions you would be presenting, you'd be presenting to staff saying, these are the questions I have. Staff could perhaps help to craft the questions in a more clear way, or to help clarify what your question is before sending it on to the applicant. But it would be difficult to avoid not discussing the particulars of the case, and it would be inappropriate for the commissioners to start to make their decision outside of the public forum. And so if the advice is simply stay as far away from anyone being able to say that the decision is being made outside of the hearing. The easiest way to do that is to say that there was no discussion outside of the hearing. And then it is very clear that no decision was made outside of the hearing. Every step we get away from that is a step closer to someone being able to allege that the decision was made behind closed doors outside of the hearing. So it's merely, it's a means of protecting the integrity of the hearing. It's not necessarily impossible, but it's advisable to be as far from that as possible.
So, Mr. Pratt, I understand that, and I think all three of us are really familiar with appearances of impropriety in any ex parte communications. But in order for a decision to be made, it requires two of us. So please correct me if I'm not understanding this right, but I would think that provided we are not having any ex parte discussions with one another or with individuals outside of the county, that we can certainly conduct independent research and inquiries of staff to get our questions answered. And to your point, any supplemental information would be, and correspondence would be made public. I just wanted to be clear.
I think you are correct, Commissioner. I think that, as I said, staff can help you to craft your questions, to work with you if there's specific issues where you don't understand on a one-on-one basis. But again, I advise you to be careful. The more detail you get into with staff, the closer we get to that line. And so obviously the easiest thing to do is to say, well, I did not discuss this with anyone outside of the hearing. But I realize there may be times where you have a specific question, whether it be a legal question for our office, or perhaps something about the regulations and how they're worded, where you may need to request staff to help you to understand what questions you may have or how to phrase those questions or to craft your concerns. But again, I advise you to be careful. The more detail you get into with staff outside of the hearing, the closer to the line you get of having made the decision outside. Not that it's impossible. It is possible, and you can, to an extent. Just advise you to be careful. Does that make sense, Commissioner?
It does, and I appreciate that, Chris, but hopefully it doesn't come to any surprise to the public that prior to any hearing, we have a lot of discussion with staff and often rely upon staff independently to provide detail, inside information, and answer questions. So I just want to be certain that that is not only appropriate, but our process going forward.
It is appropriate for you to work with staff if you have individual questions. That is appropriate outside of the hearing. Detailed questions about a specific application, again, you have to be careful, and I'm simply advising you to be careful with those. The more you ask staff about a particular application, the closer we get to that line. Obviously, general questions about how do we generally do, in this case, 18A, or this existing 2013 amendment, how exactly does that work? Those kinds of general questions would not be a concern, but there could be a line of questioning that could get into specifics that you would want to be careful having outside of the hearing. Some of those would be more appropriate to be had with the applicant and the public present. That's all I'm saying, Commissioner.
Somebody just sum it up real quick. For us commissioners, it's like we certainly have the ability to review 18A, ask all the questions we want to about 18A to staff, attorney's office, review the 2013 appeal, water appeal. That's all the questions we want about that. But certainly any questions we would have regarding this application as it applies to either 18A or that appeal should be in a public forum.
That would be the safest course of action, yes. I'm not saying you can't ever ask any questions about this particular appeal and the details of it, but the safest thing is to have those questions in the public forum.
Commissioner Partridge?
Yes.
Could we put the approval criteria back on the screen real quick, Brett? In light of your questions around the second approval criteria, I just wanted to read a section of the proposed water appeal into the record so we could get it and at least the rationale behind it.
Mr. Smathos, can you slide that a little bit closer to you? I'm sorry.
Sorry. So water demand standards of the property shall be established pursuant to a resolution of the governing board of the retail water provider.
with the written consent of Dominion, which water demand standards may be amended from time to time. Any such determination of water demand standards shall be based on supporting evidence, and the board, meaning the Board of County Commissioners, may request documentation of such evidence as necessary to allow the board to evaluate the adequacy of the water supply for each development application, except as set forth in section 6.2 below. And then section 6.2 says, to the extent a resolution establishing water demand standards is submitted in connection with any development application within the property, and such water demand standard is deemed adequate by the board, no such submittal will be required for any subsequent development application proposing the same land uses as the prior development application, except in the event of any material change in the applicable water demand standard for such land uses or the adequacy of the water supply, which the board is required to review pursuant to Colorado Revised Statute, section 29-20-303. And the reason I felt the need to read that into the record is the supporting data in the second approval criteria is really referenced, in our opinion, on the supporting evidence that's in the current proposed appeal. So there might be some word tweaking that could be done there, but that was the intent, was to match the approval criteria that's in the approval standards.
Which is good reason we need to look at streamlining, isn't it?
Yes.
Mr. Smeltz, could you give me that section you heard? I know 6.2 is referenced, but that section was?
It's section 6 of the proposed
Section 6,
2020
okay.
water appeal.
Thank you.
It's on page 228 of your packet.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate it.
So if we can go back to find a date, the next hearing would be December 8th.
We were planning to be before the board on a separate application during that time, so that time works for us.
Okay. Mr. Lytle, December 8th, are you available? Well, then forget I asked the question. So, Mr. Chair, I'm ready for a motion if you're ready.
I think we're there.
Okay, I would like to make a motion that we continue this hearing until December 8th at 2:30 in the afternoon.
Second.
So we have a motion, a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor state aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye. The motion passes, so we will continue this hearing to December 8th, 2:30 p.m. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for their testimony, their comments, their presentation, and we will, I know I've got more studying to do. Appreciate everyone. That concludes our our land use and public hearing. We are adjourned.